Welcome to the Symposium of Ætheria hosted by the Black Sky Society. We're here live from Crete, where we'll be talking about decreating cosmotechnics. That is the Simone Weil mathematical mysticism of technology and its eschatological futures. Homes are the place from which old memories take flight, yet every home drifts into memory as soon as we have departed. Crete is the lost home of Western civilization in at least three senses. The Minoan civilization is the civic predecessor of the Achaeans of Homer's epics. The labyrinth of King Minos is the trial that Theseus must overcome in order to found the city of Athens, which would later be the genesis of classical Western culture. And the Ideon cave is the nursery of Zeus, the king of the gods, whose sovereign will, like a strike of lightning, will exercise force and direction over the currents and circuits of celestial and cybernetic mechanics ever afterwards. The Ideon cave in Crete thus carries a memory of the first apocalyptic passage from the old gods of Kronos to the new gods of the Olympian pantheon, which also pertains to the technical recreation of the world. We're going? Okay, yes. Oh. 1 minute, technical difficulties. Hesiod tells of how the goddess Rhea hid Zeus in a remote cave beneath the secret places and holy places of the earth, before Zeus led the Olympian gods to overthrow the old king Kronos and cast out the Titans. Later, Apollodorus in the Argonautica also tells of how the Cretan race is descended from the 10 dactyloi who were born when Anchiale, while in the pains of childbirth, dug her fingers into the earth and brought forth the dactyloi eidoloi, that is, the Idaean fingers, which gesture beyond the ancient myth to the digital calculation of computer systems and the titanic powers that now stride across our world. Yet this passage beyond civilization in Crete also gestures to its apocalyptic finale. For the obsolescence of Minoan civilization, first portended by the volcanic eruption at Thera, from which the city of Akrotiri is now preserved as but a dim silhouette of the earliest traces of civic life that stand beyond even what we first knew of the urban civilizations of ancient Greece. The associations of this city and the surrounding island with the lost city of Atlantis should inform us not so much of the presence or absence of that fabled lost city beneath the sea, but of a memento mori for the collapse of any sufficiently advanced civilization that strives in its hubris to dominate the world with its own power of science, industry, and technology. From global financial collapses to uncontrollable artificial intelligences, we fear now the sudden and unstoppable reversal of the wheels of computation and communication that hold the world spinning like a bicycle in a single direction, hovering on either side of catastrophe. We find a mythic portent of this story, of this most contemporary anxiety, in Plato's dialogue, The Statesman. Plato presents a new version of this myth in which the divine pilot, Theos Carmeticles, rationally controls a cosmic living creature, that is, an anima mundi, endowed with living reason by the divine mind or nous, and framed by the architecture of celestial mechanics. There are two eras, he relates, of cybernetic control. In the first era, quote, God himself assists the universe on its way and guides it by imparting its rotation to it, end quote. And the second era, after its circuits under his guidance have completed the due limit, end quote, that God, quote, releases his control of celestial mechanics, at which time, quote, it begins to revolve in the contrary sense under its own principles. In the age of Kronos, God was supreme governor in charge of the actual rotation of the universe as a whole, and the particular regions were partitioned out to be provinces under the surveillance of tutelary deities, with a, quote, heavenly daemon to be its shepherd, end quote, who were all together as one flock. In this absolute mechanical metaphor, Plato describes a cybernetic axis of the frame around which turns the rotation and counter-rotation, not simply of mechanical systems, but ultimately of the sovereign will that it controls each of these systems at any sufficiently complex system of computing and cognition. In the age of Zeus, the pilot of the ship of the universe has, he says, quote, let go of the handle of its rudder and retired to his conning tower in a place apart. This pilot of the ship of the universe is, he describes, the divine pilot, the Theos Kybernetes, who, as the pilot of the ship, controls both its rotation and its counter-rotation. And yet, it seems here, at this passage from the old to the new god, this most apocalyptic moment for ancient Greek pantheon, that there is what Plato describes as a great crisis that overcomes the whole of the world, that moves not only from the initial rotation, but to a counter-rotation, and in that tension disrupts the movement both of celestial mechanics and ultimately of any complex or cybernetic system. For it had once been directed in one direction and then in another, and it results thereafter in a revolution of the heavens into something that is more like the present sense, but which is also for Plato the reverse sense, a reversal not only of motion, but perhaps also of memory, and what he calls a turning back that occurs in the celestial orbits themselves. This counter-rotation is the primordial archetype of reversal of rotation, that is, of all celestial and cybernetic mechanics, which once directed in one way can also be reversed, and in so doing can reverse not only the motion, but also the memory of the whole. The consequence of this reversal is Plato describes a cosmic crisis that has undergone not only the heavens, but also the earth, and of the loss of that divine spark that once moved humanity across the ages, that once led from its immortality to its groaning senescence, and ultimately to death that we must overcome there afterwards. This myth of the divine pilot in Plato is, I suggest, the hypothetical metaphor of the principle of cybernetics itself, and the idea of cyberneticism, in which mechanics is recursively automated, that is, in which it's the initial automated functions of its movement is recycled in its reflection, and doing so also repeated in a way that can be controlled invariably throughout both mathematical systems and computer systems over time. It governs not only the realm of the intelligible ideas, as in the formal function of recursion, but also of any mechanical system, and insofar as machines are adopted within the city-state, also a political society. Plato suggests this when he suggests that the recuperation requires not only the theft of the fire of creating human communities and of transforming the elements by Prometheus, but also and ultimately of the city-state, which is the largest cybernetic system that he knew of, from which, as it were, all arts and crafts can be orchestrated by one sovereign will, and ultimately that will can be spread across the world. And yet the danger of the city-state for him is also that it strives in its completeness to colonize the world, to expand its powers, and to technically dominate the whole world from which it draws its resources and from which it strives in hubris to rise to the power of the gods, ascending to Mount Olympus, and yet thereby threatening divine wrath. So, yes, okay. So the nursing of... Okay. The nursing of Zeus in Crete thus initiates an originary crisis that we find most especially here, but which also haunts the memory of the West, that these more sufficient and complex systems of cybernetic control, of computers, and of the computational administration of the global financial system and all that it contains can at some point in the future be reversed to initiate a crisis, and a crisis that undermines and topples the edifice of human hubris to expand across and dominate the world and gather all of its powers for ourselves. It's a parable not only for the looming collapse of our technological system of society, but also of the celestial and cybernetic mechanics that carry with them the looming uncertainty that everything that it leaps over can ultimately fall back within the abyss from which it came, fall back within the womb of its original creation and of its continual redevelopment. It suggests an anxiety of technical responsibility that can only be overcome by the continual recreation of the world, like a bicycle striding between both sides of the abyss. Also of the thinking through the possibilities that stand over the negative, and from which contradiction always looms as a possibility of uncertainty, that all that we hold to be true may yet be found to be false. It is a question not only of technology, but ultimately of dialectics, that is the possibility of thinking through the alternatives, coming to conclusions that have inner necessity of argument, but ultimately of the highest science, not only of what there is, but why it came to be, that is the science of theology. So ultimately, this points us back beyond, as it were, the divine pilot, the pilot of the universe, the pilot from which all things came, beyond the demiurge, the craftsman of the universe, to why it is the universe came to be so. Not only a universe that's eternal, that continues in its own celestial and cybernetic mechanics, but ultimately one that asks the very question of why there is anything rather than nothing, the question of theology, why we're here, and what it all means. Okay. So the question of cybernetics is ultimately the question not only of how things work, but also of how they are controlled, not only of the way that the circuits of mechanical operations continue infinitely divided in a differential or infinite mechanism that can be reassembled into digital computation and mechanical control, but ultimately, and more so, how it is that they come to be and for what purpose they come to be. That is, who controls cybernetic systems. This is, I suggest, the foremost theological question of cybernetics. For if a cybernetic system is no more possible than a perpetual motion machine, then the answer to this question cannot foreseeably be answered from within cybernetics itself. Rather, it calls for a critical analysis of the basic forms of cybernetics, from their present technological constitution to the furthermost eschatological horizons of their absolutely free assemblage. when the springs of subjective intellect can be angelically manifested across the stars and ultimately in celestial mechanics that is orchestrated through the artifice of human ingenuity in cybernetic systems that roam across the stars like the angels of old and gesture to a higher future. Long suppressed under mathematical and mechanical forms of human understanding, this human agency has lately been recognized to portend the return of the old gods of pneuma, episteme, and techne. It has been heralded by Martin Heidegger's warning of the forthcoming obsolescence of metaphysics by cybernetics. It was mythologized in Bernard Stiegler's double forgetting of Epimetheus, and it was baptized by the French Jesuit paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin's Omega Point vision of natural and technical evolution converging upon the technogenesis of a hyper-personal center of cybernetics. These competing cosmotechnical visions call for a new philosophical investigation into the revelatory and charismatic origin of cybernetics itself. We cannot no longer linger with a merely engineering understanding of how it is our mechanical systems are assembled, nor can we gesture over them to a kind of hidden supplement that restarts and reorients all of our phenomenological investigations. We have to interrogate why it is the supposed pure supplement of techne itself stands at the center of our investigation, as well as how it is that all of our engineering efforts are oriented towards it. We have, for this reason, to resituate the possibility of thinking through technology from a higher questioning of why it came to be, which is ultimately a theological questioning. The title of my work in the coming days, and that I've been undertaking here at Ætheria, is to suggest that there is not only a generally spiritual way of thinking about cybernetics, but ultimately a more specifically Catholic and even Jesuit cybernetics. After the Franciscans and the Dominicans, the Society of Jesus is the third great Catholic religious order, a Catholic eremitic order, which is dedicated to mendicant poverty, that is to renouncing the poverty, the riches of the world, as well as that of the diocese, in order to gain their wealth from the nations of others and ultimately to use it as a way of giving service to the world. In contrast to the Franciscans, who exit from the monastery to emulate the poverty of St. Francis and the apostles, and the Dominicans, who return to pray, preach, and defend from heretical subversions the teachings of the Catholic faith, the Jesuits assume both the requirements of apostolic poverty and of the defense of faith so as to advance beyond the horizons of the possible and bring the ever greater glory of God to new worlds. The Jesuit charism is thus defined by the task of glorifying God through the exploration of liminal spaces in the battlegrounds of faith in undiscovered countries, and with the printed catechisms that grew up in the 16th century of new virtual planes of learning that can be spread out as much through diagrams as through writing and the instruction of people in new ideas. Yet the new Jesuit synthesis that was achieved in scholastic metaphysics by Francisco Suarez was subsequently fractured internally by a neo-Stoic withdrawal of the world into the self-reflexive cogito of René Descartes, and externally from the neo-Augustinian suspension of free and salvific will upon claims of unmerited gift of divine grace in Cornelius Jansen. In this Jansenist Cartesian polarity of transcendent grace and immanent subjectivity, the Jesuits advanced a hidden third position in which the human will is full of grace and yet also free to achieve good works. And intellectual reflection upon these ideas that spread across the planes of diagrams and learning can produce new techniques from which the exploration not only of new lands across the sea, but also and ultimately of virtual and cybernetic spaces can yet commence. Jesuit cybernetics is, I suggest, a theoretical reconstruction of a spiritual alternative to cybernetic theory that seeks to break from the secular constitution of the study of cybernetics. It is essentially Jesuit in character, as it recalls from the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola, how cybernetic recursion is but an objectified form of human reflection, how it is angelically mediated by the essential proportions of the analogy of being, that is the analogy entis, and how it is radically centered on the divine reflections of the Son of God in the Holy Trinity, in the Trinitarian ontology of computers, which I've developed elsewhere in my essay, Sacramental Engines. So in the work that I hope to commence here, I will seek to reconstruct a theory of cybernetics that is not only genuinely spiritual, but also specifically and charismatically Jesuit, that begins in the work of Herr Schirara from a neo-Suarezian rejection of the early neo-Thomistic revival, in which the manuals of Catholic doctrines have mechanically automated to secure the scientific ground of authoritative faith, and in which the ultramontane church acts as an arbiter of extrinsically automated grace upon the terrain of pure nature. Schirara's new system of analogical metaphysics, along with Henri de Lubbock's deconstruction of pure nature, will then be radically historicized in Teilhard de Chardin's Cosmotechnics teleology of natural and technical evolution converging upon the omega point, which he calls Christogenesis, the becoming of all things like Christ at the end of the technical evolution of humans and human civilization in the future. And thereafter also historically narrated, as we find in Marshall McLuhan, his Grammar of Hot and New Media, and in another way, in Walter Ong's Hermeneutics of the Digital, which characterizes the digital and continuity with the hermeneutics of Scripture as something that always calls for its reconstitution in imagination, and in the theory of the whole that acts upon and responds to the power of divine revelation. From this eternal beginning to its end, Christ is upheld in Jesuit theology as a center of cybernetics. The function of recursion is but an objectification and mode of reflection, and this very reflexivity of human thought is but a dark mirror of these transcendent and hyperluminous reflections that descend down to us as they've always ascended upwards, not only from angelic powers, but also from the myths of old. The theological ambition of this work will be to answer Martin Heidegger's challenge that cybernetics is the end of metaphysics. He held this because he was under the spell of the expectation that we also find it another way by Wilfred von Orman Quine, that all philosophy is essentially epistemology, that all epistemology is essentially psychology, and that psychology can be better answered by the most advanced form of neuroscience. That is, a sufficiently advanced or future science will be able to answer the questions that philosophy poses for human reflection, but for which the human mind as a plastic and fragile medium is inadequate ultimately to answer. When cybernetics supersedes metaphysics, the most originate question of being in relation to the categories appears to be suppressed under this objectified concept, whether of techne or tool use, or more ultimately of gargantuan machines that present answers to our questions and appear to render obsolete all human thinking. And when the trace of techne or technics is held to be both the essential condition for and yet ultimately unanalyzable beyond itself, for the transcendental deduction of the categories, thinking it appears to become paralyzed by a kind of metaphysical empiricism that more and more fuses the inner questions of metaphysics, not only of what there is, but why it must be so. Yet, as I will seek to illustrate, the Jesuits had already conceived of a more spiritual and cybernetic theory. Jesuit cybernetics assumes a neo-Suarezian centering of the essential being of universal mechanism and particular computers upon the central principle of the Christian Trinity, that is, of Christ and the hypostatic union that spreads its wings and radiance across the church, while secular cybernetics assumes either a neo-Kantian formalization of mechanical and mathematical recursive functions, as we find in Norbert Wiener, or post-Kantian deconstruction of this culmination of metaphysics in an infinite succession of more originary supplements, whether of being or of writing, or ultimately of tool use, that is, of techne, which in its analyzable plurality trace of power merely invokes a kind of Nietzschean will to power that ranges across the intermediaries of mechanical and cybernetic systems. In each case, cybernetic engines carry a trace automation of increasingly concentrated reflections that strives towards the completeness of its mechanical operations to return to know its highest principle. Where post-Heideggerian cybernetics regards techne as the essential aperture of the concept, de Lubac and Desjardins recycle this in every supplement as a concentrated mode of spiritual exteriorization, spiraling around a hyperbolic cone into an apocalyptic nova of Christ, who is at the center but also at the end, both at the eternal end and the eternal beginning, and a gesture to over the present moment to the eschaton. Explicitly in Desjardins, its eschatology orients the Christological transparency of concepts to intellect and analysis in concepts, such that even the supplement of techne, that is posited as the beginning of phenomenological inquiry, becomes rendered intellectually transparent to humans in their angelic search through the sequence of questions that can be asked of it, and ultimately through the metaphysical hierarchy of being and its concepts in such a way that it can return back to its source and be situated in the order of being as it's known by the order of knowing. Okay, so in the work that I have commenced here at Ætheria, there's two wings of my project. The one is to reconstruct, as I've suggested, a specifically Jesuit way of thinking about cybernetics. The Jesuit order here has been chosen because they represent in their charism, in their spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius Loyola, but also in their pragmatism, in reaching out into the liminal spaces of the world, a way of engaging with not only the matters of the spirit, but also of matters with the mind and the body, and through them also with like the dactyloi of old, with the way that our fingers are exteriorized into tool use, into machines, digital computation, and ultimately with the entire digital world that ranges across the world and informs our every thought. And the Jesuits also have radically questioned the fundamental assumptions that undergird secular cybernetic theory. They've questioned, for instance, the possibility of constructing a complete system, not only of science, but also mechanics and cybernetics. They've questioned the Heideggerian move to a searching for an essential supplement that is, as it were, ungrounded and yet freely showing of itself in so many disclosures, breaking through clearings, but also in ones that can be reorchestrated from a more technical standpoint or marginal standpoint, whether it be in Derrida's supplement of writing or in the new supplement of Techne that appears like the tool use of our ancient simian ancestors to reorchestrate and integrate the possibility of exploring all of these concepts in a way that's quasi-empirical and yet more philosophical. And in doing so, in critiquing Heidegger and developing a new Catholic synthesis that's not simply Thomistic or Suarezian, but one that takes its leap over the failures of modern idealism that strove for completeness in a Titanic and pagan way, they also have gestured to the possibility of a theological interrogation into all of these minute and specific fields. So in my survey of secular cybernetics, I trace the development not through the positive aspect of Norbert Wiener, his successor, but rather through the idealist, or you might say the speculative aspect of the post-Heideggerian cybernetic theorists. In particular, I focus on three thinkers, on Gilbert Simondon, who was a proto-Deleuzian theorist of technical objects, and he was a great inspiration both on Bernard Stiegler and on Yu Kui. Then on the late, great Bernard Stiegler, whose work, The Techniques in Time, The Myth of Epimetheus, recalled the mythological beginnings, the double-faced movements of looking backwards and forwards, of doubly forgetting the origin of technics, but also of remembering its higher destiny, and thereby also of reinterrogating techniques as a standpoint of first philosophy in a way that he believed had been rendered obsolete by Martin Heidegger, but which could be reinitiated in a quasi-empirical framework in the present day, engaging with all the aspects that touch upon our daily lives and shape the moment in the most new way. And thirdly, and most particularly in the work of Yu Kui, who I believe as one of the most sophisticated current cybernetic theorists has investigated themes of art, cursivity, and more ultimately of what he calls cosmotechnics, which is a kind of religious unification of the moral and the technical order in such a way that it shows techniques or the use of technology never to be entirely without moral scrutiny and moral purpose, something that is created by us and used by us and assumes what it becomes what it is through the use that we make of it. Now, cosmotechnics is very interesting because it suggests that there's never been what Gadamer would characterize as a religious horizon to the creation and the use of machines or of tools, that they, like writing, they only are what they are through the literature that grows up from them or the way in which they're used in a collective whole by human society. Moreover, he suggests in his recent works a notion that he calls cosmotechnical pluralism, that is the possibility of escaping from, for him, the Occidental histories of technology that we find, especially in Martin Heidegger, who's in his suspicion of Plato and the Platonic turn, the amnesiac. Oh, okay. And in Martin Heidegger's forgetfulness of the question of being at the origin of Western metaphysics, that continually overcodes the possibility of answering that question with new forms that suppress in their determinacy the possibility of raising that question anew. So he wants to find a Oriental way, or even a non-Oriental way, a peculiar local way of thinking about techniques again, one that isn't dominated from without by something like the way that Bruno Latour characterizes the hegemony of the Royal Society and the modern world that's been shaped by the expectation of complete mastery over the world through the use of technical devices and scientific engines. Now, I believe that this cosmotechnical pluralism is in fact an invitation for religious reinterrogation of the fundamental forms and ideas of tool use, of techniques, but more ultimately of computers and cybernetics. That is, I believe that once we admit for a kind of relative plurality of different perspectives on the use of tools, we also can ask the great questions that are raised by our oldest myths and revelations that situate our understanding and our moral interrogation of these tools. And this, I suggest, opens up the possibility not only for a general spiritual cybernetics, one that doesn't rest its the possibility of constructing machines on the bare matter of machines, rather looks to their form, but ultimately the form that is itself the product of the spirit, but also, and more specifically, a Catholic and Jesuit cybernetics. Catholic being the most philosophical religion that grew up from the ancient Mediterranean world that still endures with us, and the Society of Jesus being the one that has consistently and most thoroughly had interrogated through its pragmatism and its embodied explorations of liminal spaces, the order of machines and cybernetics. So in the work of these great 20th century Jesuit thinkers, I've attempted to reconstruct a kind of composite theory that has always been forgotten and yet can still be reconstructed and represented as a foil to post-Heideggerian and secular cybernetics. In particular, I focus on the work of Eryszy Rara, a great Polish Jesuit, who in his work Analogy Intus Universal Rhythm had not only critiqued Martin Heidegger for what he called his theopanism, or his pantheism, rather, pantheism by, as it were, reducing the possibility of recognizing the principle of God beyond creation to something that was, as it were, shown forth in infinite disclosures from within the material and finite world of creaturely understanding, but also in his attempt to reorchestrate all of metaphysics around this unanswerable rhythm that always gestured over and beyond it in a kind of hyperbolic cone that only momentarily resituates the presence of being in such a way that there is an inner little tension that is ultimately rhythmic and that from which we continually pass beyond as though in a Kierkegaardian way, breaking through the objectified aporia or paradoxes of metaphysics. Beyond that, I argue that in the mystery of the supernatural, that Henri de Lubach's theological deconstruction of the nature-supernature divide that is inherited from the late medieval and early modern era in the opposition between extrinsic grace and immanent nature, that it provides a framework for a general theological use, not only of deconstruction, but also dianetics. That is a way of interrogating where our assumptions lead, where they lead into contradictions, where those contradictions unsettle and cancel the movement of reason from the beginning. And in doing so, suspend the operation of reason and calls for its reorchestration. And in this way, I also suggest that the undermining of a notion of pure nature ultimately undermines the possibility of pure reason, that is pure a priori reason that in its totalizing mathematical embrace and its totalizing logic or anything like that, whether it be technologically augmented, could ever possibly hope to provide us with answers to all of our questions, even those of theology. And finally, moreover, that if this applies not only to the way that we, our brains, think through it, but also through artificial brains might think of it, then it applies also to computers. That is, it applies also to the adequacy of any computationally augmented system of reason that could hope to cognitively master and dominate the whole of the universe in the way that not only the ancient Athenians had in the Peloponnesian War, but more perhaps ultimately and mythically, the way the Atlanteans had attempted to accomplish in the myth that Plato tells us of the lost island that is hidden now between the sea. So with all that said, I want to point to the work of the French paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin as someone who offers us a eschatological vision of how it is that our cosmotechnical expectations of the moral order that converges with tool use can continually advance in stages yet to come. And while I recognize that Teilhard de Chardin has been resoundingly criticized and perhaps even forgotten by most scientists, whether they be paleontologists or in many cases also technology theorists, and on the other hand, Catholic religious who have looked upon him with suspicions of heresy for ostensibly renouncing a kind of Augustinian view of transcendence in favor of a kind of spiritual immanence that's augmented by technological powers, I believe nonetheless that he presents us with a kind of roadmap for the possibility of our cosmotechnical evolution that is yet to come. One that is not simply secular, but is always spiritual. One that its mystical ambits also gestures beyond itself to what he calls the plateaus of higher being, to new concentrations of the orchestrations of complexity at higher level systems, and ultimately to what he calls the hyperpersonality, which isn't, as it were, in the debates about Chalcedonian union of Christ, merely that of God beyond the world or a personality that enters into the world, but about our personality, the possibility that our personality, who we are and what we want to be, our attention upon the world in the way that it is always answerable to new changes within the world that elicit our desire and interest, whether that will change recursively, and in doing so carry us beyond ourselves to become something new, such that we will not only spread our wings like angels across the stars, but our own interior thoughts will become more subtle, profound, and delicate as they answer to the most hidden challenges that are raised by machines and by our contemporary world. So with all that said, I'm grateful for your attendance, and I hope that we'll have a very lively discussion. And I hope to pass off the baton now to my duet speaker, Anna Winters. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Is this actually connected, the microphone? Hello? Oh, okay. All right, let me see if I can get my phone positioned to do this. It was working before. Okay. So I prepared some short remarks focusing on Simone Weil's critique of technocracy and her theory of mediation as an answer to that critique. Trying to kind of bring it back towards the end to I think a fruitful vector for further discussion with Ryan and his analysis of cybernetics, which we will return to after I read you my remarks. Okay. Simone Weil's theory of mediation must be understood as an answer to the peculiar state of social distress arising from the ascendancy of modern nihilistic technocracy. As she puts it, the problem is therefore quite clear. It is a question of knowing whether it is possible to conceive of an organization of production which, though powerless to remove the necessities imposed by nature and the social constraint arising therefrom, would enable these at any rate to be exercised without grinding down souls and bodies under oppression. For Weil, modern technocratic oppression is fundamentally a spiritual failing, which involves the defensive rejection of an effort of mediation between technology and the cosmos, a cosmos which is itself a form of mediation between human capacities and divine love. This effort of mediation inevitably also demands not just a human spiritual sensitivity to cosmic order, but also the discovery of mediating principles between different social strata, encompassing the whole of human activity as a set of hidden correspondences between manual and intellectual labor within the medium of divine love, conceived as itself humanity's supernatural destiny. As such, she is particularly critical of the ethos of specialization. I quote, "At all levels, we are brought up against the same obstacle. The whole of our civilization is founded on specialization, which implies the enslavement of those who execute to those who coordinate. And on such a basis, one can only organize and perfect oppression, not lighten it." In Weil's account, the pursuit of power and control over others through climbing the technocratic hierarchy of specialization not only grinds down the souls and bodies of the unskilled laborer, but that of the skilled laborer as well. Humanity itself, as a whole, has reduced its intellectual and spiritual horizon to a practice of self-enslavement to a blind principle of power, which is itself what the reign of cosmic necessity is reduced to when pridefully challenged, rather than given its due as a principle of loving mediation with God. I quote, "Thus there is, in the very essence of power, a fundamental contradiction that prevents it from ever existing in the true sense of the word. Those who are called masters, ceaselessly compelled to reinforce their power for fear of seeing it snatched away from them, are forever seeking a dominion impossible to obtain. It would be otherwise if one man could possess in himself a force superior to that of many men put together, but such is never the case. The instruments of power always exist independently of him who disposed of them, and can be taken up by others. Consequently, all power is unstable." They contrast this blind submission to power as a principle of the lower register of material history, trapping within itself all those who have resisted their love for a higher divine guidance irreducible to this cycle, with what she described as a pact between the mind and the universe. This pact is multiply mediating because it allows for both a relative recognition of certain necessities according to a principle of humility and the cultivation of a supernatural horizon of divine love, which finds an absolute terminus for these relative necessities in a principle of unconditioned good. I quote, "To react against the subordination of the individual to the collective implies that one begins by refusing to subordinate one's own destiny to the course of history. In order to resolve upon undertaking such an effort of critical analysis, all one needs is to realize that it would enable him who did so to escape the contagion of folly and collective frenzy by reaffirming on his own account, over the head of the social idol, the original pact between the mind and the universe." Weil strongly believed in the capacity of the rational correspondences embedded in the psychocosmic pact to establish terms of mediation even within domains characterized more fundamentally by apparent irrationality and mystery. By finding select footholds for effective comparative thinking, which would allow for the discovery of patterns of analogical significance applicable in concrete mediating practices, she affirmed that rational bridges could be built across immense and apparently irrational social and cosmic distances, provided that they are guided by a faith in the underlying guidance of these ratios by a transcendent supernatural love. I quote, "The system of eudoxis, by which a ratio between weights can be equal to a ratio between times, etc. How is it that we allow ourselves not to refer to it in education? If it is a case of rational ratios, 3 hours out of 2 hours as 3 kilos out of 2 kilos, at bottom the notion is the same, but concealed by the numbers. Since it is possible in this way to raise the notions in the case of two completely different pairs of magnitudes, one could hope to be able also to apply the notion of ratio to psychological and spiritual matters. Psycho-spiritual ratios, in this sense, though conceived initially on the model of a sort of sacred geometry, would of course not be amenable to the typical scientific conceit of phenomenalistic formalism accessible to a passively socialized reflective intellect, but rather would rely upon practices of an actively individual, if also potentially shared, attention to the sites where the default condition of force's destructive self-expansion instead pass over into determinate relations of mediated participation in a good which can only be conceived in terms of a creative and divine power, rather than a nihilistic one, at the limit of phenomena. Here, Vey provides a somewhat apocalyptic metaphor wherein the cosmos features as an egg, incubating the bird that is its destiny in divine love. The egg is this world which we see. The bird in it is love, the love which is God himself and which lives in the depths of every man, though first as an invisible need. When the shell is broken and the being is released, it still has this same world before it, but it is no longer inside. Space is opened and torn apart. The spirit, leaving the miserable body in some corner, is transported to a point outside space, which is not a point of view, which has no perspective, but from which the world is seen as it is, unconfused by perspective. Compared to what is inside the egg, space has become an infinity to the second, or rather the third power. The moment stands still. The whole of space is filled, even though sounds can be heard, with a dense silence, which is not an absence of sound, but is a positive object of sensation. It is the secret word, the word of love who holds us in his arms from the beginning. A key feature of the metaphysics of love on offer in Vey's Christian Platonism is that its foundation in the erotic lack of the creature can only ultimately rest in the all-giving power of the divine creator, which the Christian tradition recognizes as the most radical form of love, agape. Against the arguments of Anders Nygren, the Vey scholar Erik Springstad defends the existence of a continuity between Platonic eros and Christian agape at work in Vey's philosophy, which is already nascent in Plato's own work. In this connection, he quotes Diotima's speech from Plato's Symposium as follows. Love is not exactly a longing for the beautiful. It is a longing not for the beautiful itself, but for the conception and generation that the beautiful effects. This connects also to Vey's insistence that true freedom can only occur through the connection between thought and action, rather than through the connection between desire and satisfaction. Satisfaction is always the appropriation of reality's absolute limit for the purposes of the strengthening of a particular perspective. But genuine mediation exceeds the horizon of satisfaction by establishing, through concrete action, a deepening of the shared participation of multiple perspectives in the absoluteness of a divine love in and beyond this world. This also does require what Vey calls a decreation of particular perspectives. But for her, the metaphysical horizon of this decreation still remains an expressly neo-Pythagorean resonance between selves which, all the more for their sacrifice of the delusional temptations of the supremacy of force, even at the risk of affliction, the journey into a black sky, achieve an organic spiritual harmony where each may discover the fullness of their actual spiritual destiny. Thus, the perspective of the individual does not stand over against a nothingness, even if this perspective is collectivized opposite this nothingness in the form of shared historical agency, but rather stands over against and with the absolute positive gift of its own existence, in a sort of transcosmic agapeic harmony of all things within geometrically mediated proportions, spiritually instantiating divine love. As such, the creature's obligation is to concretely reciprocate this divine love in all things, so as to resonate in its truth and to reveal this in concert with other vulnerable persons, all too inclined towards an evasion of this supernatural destiny in the abyss of force's horizon. Okay, that's what I prepared. I think we can shift now to a discussion between me and Ryan about some of the themes that we presented and how they fit together.
Wonderful. I was tremendously inspiring. I'm so grateful for the chance to exchange some ideas and hopefully develop some new ones. So I want to ask about how it is that we can establish mediation in the world today. So obviously there have been forces of alienation at work, perhaps primordially, but perhaps continuously and accelerating today. And even in Simone Weil's own time has suppressed the possibility of genuine mediation, whether it be between the classes and among the workers, or perhaps even more minutely as we have attention to things that are sacred, holy, and life-giving. Now, I take it that one of the greatest challenges to mediation today is not so much the alienation of labor, but something like what Gilbert Simondon characterizes the alienation of technology. That is the possibility that in thinking of technology as something separate from ourselves, we also not only attempt to control it as something that we're subaltern or without a soul, but also that we see our own action as though it's entering into upon it without technological mediation. Another way of saying this is that technology, in as far as we've suppressed it as a kind of slave class, always reemerges in a way that haunts our every step and our every thought and action. Now, would you find, as someone who uses technology quite a lot, not only in your artistic practices, but also in your communication with the world, that there is ways in which it becomes a source of disattention, of perhaps a loss of oneself, and also of new forms of alienation that compromise the possibility of establishing that harmonious mediation that invites something like neighborly and divine love?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I think technology, it's like, it's definitely not a strictly neutral medium. Um, if anything, though, what I would say is that precisely because it's not a neutral medium, rather than seeing it as either entirely good or entirely bad, the only way to take it is to see it as kind of this intensifying vector, where it's like we either push technology in a direction that is increasingly destructive and nihilistic, or we push it in a direction that is increasingly mediated and open to divine grace and love. So I feel like there is kind of this inner polarization that occurs in most usages of technology, that people either kind of like start moving in one direction or another. Of course, they can kind of be mixed. There can be kind of different tendencies that are connected in some kind of complex whole. But my own experience of like, especially being on social media a lot and sort of using that to connect with like-minded people and develop different sorts of groups of those people. I do think that there is kind of this capacity that technology has in many ways as kind of like a materialization of a spiritual world, which otherwise would not be instantiated in the form that it is and connect people in the way that it does. But precisely because it has this power, as with many other extremely sort of socially and materially supercharged mechanical phenomena, it can obviously be extremely sort of violently and threateningly exploited for the service of particular, not especially pro-social perspectives. And I think the big challenge is basically just to develop a sense for in what ways and where we can see this kind of polarization operating in different positive and negative uses of technology sort of being established.
Amazing. So one of the themes that I've been interested in is how it is that powers from ostensibly beyond the world seem to intrude upon the world. And you mentioned how it is that technology seems like it invites the descent of spiritual forces or becomes an instantiation and material manifestation within the world of spiritual powers. Now, of course, one of the things that people are often fascinated by technology is how it seems to invoke more than material causes, or more than efficient causes even. So the digital computer, very famously, seems to invoke a whole sort of grammar of mathematical calculations that it uses to orchestrate every activity. And in another sense, the algorithms that seem to orchestrate our social media environment, as well as our buying choices and advertisements, are all dictated from without by some kind of very, very complex but inscrutable and ephemeral series of forces that seem something like an Epicurean pantheon of rarefied gods that sort of intrude upon our lives. Now, is there some sense in which we might say that technology has always been something of a gift from the gods? So, for instance, Plato describes in the Philebus how dialectics is like the fire that Prometheus stole from the gods, and as far as it seems like it's able to sift between and then to discover from within that the power of the ideas. That is also in another way the power of the spirits, or the power of knowing and creating the world. Could we say, for instance, that technology is something like in the myth of the dactyloi, that is something drawn from the earth and yet something more than the earth? And lastly, might we say that the ways by which we're reorchestrating it, whether it be in our arts or whether it be in sort of artistically mediated environments, is a kind of summoning of the power of the gods, or something that draws us together in something that's not simply erotic or a domination by lust, but something that carries with it the possibility of neighborly love?
So in this case, I feel like yes, like in some sense, to take it back to We's metaphysics, one of the big themes that she kind of centers is this question of cosmic necessity and like what is necessity in a fundamental level. I feel like technology is sort of this weird vector where it's like on the one hand, the premise for it is a conceptual grasp of cosmic necessity, which then is sort of practiced in action. So it's like actualized knowledge of cosmic necessity, which is then used to creatively instantiate human will. Um, Now it's interesting that there are various places where, Simone Weil talks about the concept of the supernatural. And one of those places she actually defines the supernatural itself as the alignment of will and necessity. So in this sort of same sense, I feel like, when you have the sort of this like Promethean creative power of technology, this is always kind of this, in many ways, deeper opportunity for the alignment of will and necessity, and therefore of supernatural reality, than is there in sort of simply the satisfaction of a fantasy. So in this sense, technology is really a kind of incredible opportunity for sort of bringing more spiritual forces that are connected to goodness and divine love to earth. the sort of problem that arises is the way that what Simone Weil would think of as idolatry is sort of this point where necessity itself becomes conflated with the good. So in order for technology to actually be a conduit for goodness, it kind of has to be directed towards something outside of itself. And this is sort of where the like decreating cosmotechnics, like the sort of cosmic horizon of technological necessity, kind of cannot insist strictly upon itself and become its own sort of attractor force of polarization, which I think just leads to an endless kind of sort of abyss of potentiality where nothing really concretely good actually occurs or is sort of held up as a possibility that is founded in actuality, but rather kind of recognize that technology is sort of this mediating force in itself, that it's not the limit, it's not the truth, and its capacities are kind of not our salvation sort of through itself and through those capacities, but would actually require some kind of genuine non-technological spiritual supplement to itself that allows itself to bring human destiny into it rather than kind of sort of answering human destiny from outside of that human destiny itself.
Marvelous. Well, I have one more question, and then I hope we can maybe take some questions from the audience. So I was intrigued by, well, first of all, on the topic of decreating cosmotechnics, which is the titular theme of this seminar, I wanted to ask about how it is that our moral expectations of technology become unhinged, or whether they, or as it were, unloosed. So that is, on the one hand, how technology sort of escapes our moral expectations. On the other hand, how our moral expectations can perhaps overdetermine or perhaps undergird technology that is inadequate to its own inner development. And one of the ways in which this comes across, and it was something that you alluded to previously, was in the secret world of the cosmic egg. So as you may remember, this is a theme that we have from the ancient Orphic hymns, and it's something that comes from the Pythagoreans. And Simone Weil was very interested in all of this because it's just a kind of womb-like genesis of the forms of creation, the forms that may be arithmological or geometrical, but also may have a kind of inner correspondence that carries with it vectors of spiritual powers, as in, for instance, the analogy of being or sacred geometry. Another way we can think of this is that there are certain contaminants to the possibility of that free expectation of divine love that is originally found but afterwards corrupted. And this could occur, for instance, in the way that you described how the specialization of labor seems to, on the one hand, fragment human society so as to empower some at the expense of others in relative tasks and disciplines, but at the same time, while ostensibly augmenting the avenues of the technical enhancement and direction of human agency, can at the same time create the conditions for domination of one class over the other, one specialized field over the other, and ultimately the aggregation of all power and technical pursuits to a single dominant class. And we see that more and more today now that computer technology, as the most general machine, is able to simulate and create all sort of mechanical systems, gather to itself all power and ultimately all commodity resources that can then be used to virtually simulate and create any possible engine of activity and labor across the world. So what I'm suggesting is perhaps that our moral expectations of the possibility of a kind of religious fusion have always already come unloosed, that they were never satisfactory. So even, for instance, the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, their expectation that they would become like gods by eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or ever afterwards in every attempt to sort of religious synthesis, whether it be in the Oracle of Delphi as a kind of conduit of divine prophecy that would orchestrate the confederation of Greek city-states, or in the alliance of Christian states against on the one hand, the Turks, on the other hand, of emergent financial capitalism, and whether there's some way of recovering this, whether it requires a kind of hermetical expectation that there's a hidden correspondence of geometrical forms, or whether it's something that perhaps requires that this unloosening accelerates, that it should overcome once again, break the egg of the world and sort of apocalyptic finale, or whether that apocalypse has happened already and yet to come. And whether there's some way that we can find sort of conduits and threads of love that can yet unite us again in spite of the catastrophes that await us.
Okay, there's a lot there. Um, yeah, I mean, so I think that the apocalyptic theme is an interesting one to hit on a little bit more, also with your discussion of Teilhard de Chardin. Because I feel like one interesting thing, and this is going to connect, I think, to me hitting you back with another question about your presentation and specifically how you kind of were trying to loop Teilhard de Chardin into that. And I guess after this, we can kind of jump to some of the other questions. Is so this question that you also kind of just brought up is like, does this apocalyptic process sort of just stand ahead of us, or is it something that's already happening, or is it something that's already happened? I feel like this is like a extremely kind of significant interpretive question. Really for like for all of Christian theology as well, is sort of like what is the like apocalyptic promise of theology? Even outside of Christianity, like, you know, this question of like, do we have like, even in like, for example, Heideggerian terms, like a God that we can expect to come to kind of save us in some sense. That kind of question is really, really important. And I guess the question that I have about Teilhard connects to, I was thinking about Simone Weil's critique of Marxism. And one of the big sort of issues that she has with Marxism, which kind of also reflects back into an issue she has with Hegel, is that there is sort of this what she considers to be like a vulgar conception of providence that sort of takes human agency out of it. So it's like sort of just this almost naive trust in sort of blind historical development, that it's like there is sort of this imminent process within history that people just have to latch onto, and that it by itself and of itself will deliver us from all suffering and pain. That there is kind of this inner sort of process within the cosmos that sort of without this I guess agony of individual cultivation towards the good is capable itself of liberating us. And so this is the big unexamined assumption that she takes issue with in Marxism. And I guess my question is like, to what extent do you think that Teilhard maybe still falls victim to this, and to what extent do you think that he is capable, like his perspective is capable of overcoming it? Because I feel like there's this aspect of his thought which you brought up in your talk, that is oriented towards, yes, kind of like this spiritual reinterpretation of the technological horizon, right? That it's not just sort of like saying technology is itself spiritual and will save us, but is that there is this other horizon that we can sort of determinately and with our own agency orient technology towards. um and I feel like that's kind of the sticking point to some extent, where it's like, to what extent do we see ourselves sort of really having to affect the separation between like cosmic idolatry or whatever, which would reduce the good to something sort of forceful, instrumental, and to what extent can we sort of see beyond that horizon and recognize that there is a separation between sort of cosmic necessity taken alone as something that just sort of destroys, and cosmic necessity as a mediating principle with a higher good.
Thank you. Yes. So the Belle Epoque era was often defined as this kind of heady but hubristic expectation of perpetual progress, by which new developments in technology would lead to social advancements and improvements. And of course, it all came apart with the great world wars of the 20th century. Now, there's certainly something of a kind of secular progress that's expected in Teilhard de Chardin, but also a kind of imminently naturalized one. So the model that he's working with is the gradual complexification of life on Earth as a metaphor for the gradual complexification of human technology as an augmentation of human life, by which humans will expand cognition and the spirit across the cosmos, and ultimately in a way that will reverse entropy and lead to a kind of perpetual peace through the cosmos. Now, the amazing thing about that is that it's never really worked, even in natural orders. That is, we've suffered at least 5 mass extinction events, and arguably we're undergoing something like that today with human augmentation of the Earth. And I think with the anxiety that we have about human intervention in the Earth's ecosystem, with not only in the loss of animal species and animal biodiversity, but also in the geological constitution of the Earth and our future destiny, whether it be with the melting of the polar ice caps, or with a great frost that comes from that, or anything in between, global pandemics perhaps, that we recognize something of the great uncertainty that the future natural but also technical destiny of mankind comes with. I mentioned this briefly in my comments about how we have a new anxiety, not as it were sort of like attack from Mars or something from without that would come unto us like the ancient Magyars or Mongols, but rather as a self-generated pathogen, whether it be of advanced artificial intelligence or some kind of out of control system. And in a way, Crete is reminiscent of that. Long people had suspected that it was the Mycenaeans, for instance, that came to conquer Crete, but it may have actually been a global system collapse that led to the palatial economy of the ancient Bronze Age collapsing here and overthrowing the order of the world. So I think that Tyler does, in a way, fall prey to that. Although, in his defense, even those mass extinctions events also allow for the new biodiversity to emerge. That is, to the previously dominant forms of life gave way to ones that were more adaptable. And I think we might say that as well. Now, it might not be humans that endure afterwards, but he suspects that life will endure nonetheless. And perhaps it will be the hidden and subaltern forms of humanity and human life that persist in spite of the great empires that range across the world today. Now, where does this idea come from? I think in a way it's invested in a Christian eschatological hope. So Carl Lewith wrote a very famous book that I believe it's something like the history and philosophy, or the philosophy of history and its destiny, in which he described how it was Christianity that uniquely reorients our eschatological hopes in the ancient world. And you can find this explicitly in Origin of Alexandria's commentary on the Romans, where in contrast to the Stoic eternal recurrence, by which, as it were, everything always returns around an identical way through the cycle of conflagrations or ekpyrosis, that in Christianity, uniquely because of the incarnation, there's a trajectory of human history that is once set in motion and is directed towards an end by which it will be completed at the end from its beginning. Now, this is very paradoxical because it seems like it were to suggest that the beginning and the end will be the same, and yet the end will be more than the beginning. It's a kind of excess that gestures to the excess of divine love that can only be possible not in the order of time and geometry, but ultimately in something that exceeds them, something that exceeds and unite them all together at once. Now, I think that there's another sense in which he takes it from the background of Marx, which is from Hegel. That is, Hegel, in his philosophy of history, describes how the history is itself the realization of freedom, and freedom, as it were, rational necessity, but ultimately rational necessity that's guided by a devotion towards the good of one's neighbor, and ultimately the good of the rational state that orchestrates the possibility of something like agape, that by which the Christian community, and it's called, shows the possibility of free charity, sacrificial generosity towards one another, even under the formal rubric of the modern state. Now, whether that can go right today, I think, is an open question, and one that we're perhaps witnessing ever again. We just saw sort of the exchange of missiles between world powers. We're seeing the possibility of nuclear proliferation on the horizon. We're seeing the return of great power rivalries, and all of these suggest looming possibility. We saw vividly displayed in film Oppenheimer that nuclear annihilation and apocalypticism is yet on the table again. So what I would try to suggest is that we don't really know how technology will reshape not only the future of human use of machines, but even the human body itself, or of the biosphere, or of the way that we engage with the natural world. So one emerging example of this is something like cottagecore or solar punk, that on the one hand sort of try to engage with the primitive, while at the same time trying to explore the possibility of using new technologies to gather energy and orchestrate that energy in surprising new ways. And so we might see something like lateral and alternative subversions of this fantasy of federal technological improvement. So rather than, for instance, having a kind of Isaac Asimov Foundation series imagining where the empire of the earth is going to sort of grow to a cosmic and galactic level, we might see something more spontaneous and surprising, whereby humans adapt to new environments in unique and startling ways that orchestrate the possibility of creativity and freedom in new ways as well. And there's another aspect of this I just want to briefly touch on, is that Gallagher doesn't seem to fully anticipate how art is always unsatisfied with the cliched repetition of things yet to come. So any system of social order that is as it were infinitely repeated, or in such a way that it becomes dominant simply in virtuous repetition, is always going to be unsatisfying to the creative intellect. So in a way, our Ætheria Symposium, the possibility of gathering artists together with philosophers and theologians, is also a way of showing that even technology has to be rethought from an artistic standpoint. That is the possibility of giving objective form to human freedom.
Yes. Do we have any other questions that we might want to go over from other people? Or people commenting in the call? I mean, sorry, in the Zoom.
If people want to go on video, raise your hand and you can be promoted to a panelist. Otherwise, in the webinar, there is a section for questions where you can type in a question and I'll read it out loud.
Well, I thought there were some already, but if there aren't, we can kind of continue talking while people compose things. So I did want to sort of respond to that question of art or aesthetics as this idea of the formal or objective realization of human freedom. So what's interesting there is that aesthetic mediation or mediation through the beautiful is sort of this fundamental feature of Diotima's speech in Plato's Symposium, which is one of the main sort of inspirations for Simone Weil's account of mediation. And this idea that, like I also brought up, that what is really happening at the horizon of love is love not just for the beautiful, but for the kind of effects of beauty. and like how beauty kind of itself is a creative and begetting force. And it's interesting here where I feel like there is a sense in which beauty can be seen as an autonomizing force analogous to God in kind of an sort of way that is can be opposed to force or power as an autonomizing force that is analogous to forces of evil or forces of kind of nothingness, destruction. That there are sort of, typically people think that humans create things that autonomize from them and kind of just destroy them, overcome them, consume them. This is sort of Heidegger's very pessimistic account of technology and cybernetics as replacing metaphysics as this sort of like, the user of the tool is consumed and overpowered by his own tool. But I feel like we can see beauty and sort of especially like this idea of harmonious relations in like the broadest sense of harmony, kind of drawing on Pythagorean mystical tradition. Um, that I think that this can be seen as another form of the autonomization of, I'm not sure if I would say an instrument, but something that is created over the creator. Um, and in this way, we can also look at this from a Trinitarian perspective that there are kind of these different persons within the Godhead itself. And that this kind of also can be brought back to human practice where we see human activities in sort of expressing and instantiating human freedom in especially kind of shared human freedom embedded within the cosmos, within these initiatives that bring people together to kind of accomplish things, reflecting their destinies back to themselves and each other. And we can see this as a form of kind of like counter autonomization, sort of against the way that sort of pure necessitarian cosmic force autonomizes, consumes, destroys, and sort of overcomes human goodness. So.
We do have a question from an anonymous attendee. The question is, what is the place of logismoi, demonic or angelic thoughts in a Catholic cybernetic cosmology?
Okay, yes. So logismoi is the Greek word for calculation. It's the word from which we also have the word syllogismo. Syllogismo is a syllogism. And the question is, at what point does does calculation enter into a Catholic theology of computers and machines? Now, what I would have argued is that it's not something that we should fear, that it's rather a very simple use of automation of counting. And in as far as counting coming from fingers and the way that we sort of act with fingers and primitive tool use upon the world is something that is unique to human, but also one of the glories of humankind, that we can sort of manipulate the world in this way, not only through our bodies, but also through our minds, that we have no reason of fearing calculation per se. And one of the reasons why I think people have feared calculation is something of like what Anna was describing, whereby there seems to be a kind of automation and objectification of instruments of calculation. So in as far as we can create tools that seem to be released from us and act independently of us, increasingly today with the most general machines, that is computers, that appear to be automated and even accelerating in their capacity over generations in a way that can render obsolete human intelligence, we seem to have, as it were, lost the possibility of thinking or given it over to something beyond ourselves that can render us obsolete and ultimately extinct. Now, I think the danger here is in as far as we have always thought that, or we have tended to think increasingly in the modern era, that our tools are something that are indifferent to us, that they are something that is something without a soul, not shaped by a soul, and also not imbued with and directed for any higher spiritual purpose that we share amongst with them. So rather than treating calculation as though it creates a kind of virtual plane of immanence that suffocates or excludes the possibility of theological expectation, of hope and love, and ultimately of transcendence and entering into something like beatific vision or of mystical embrace, I think rather we should see it as one of many ways in which our thought shoots in various directions, takes flight in such a way that can create the occasion for new ways of celebrating the world and all of the mystery and wonder that it embraces. So a very good example of this is music. Obviously, music is something that involves levels of mathematical rhythm and proportion and sequences that can be represented through musical script, but also increasingly through computer systems and the way that we have sort of computer-enhanced tracking of musical motifs and and tones and rhythms. But at the same time, it's also something that when we hear it, it transforms time into the occasion for leaping beyond that vocal present or that the audible present, and shows us new as it were dances and flips of time and space, flips of time that manifested in space and the tones of space. So obviously the musical traditions that we find in the Mass, in sympathies, and also in all of our celebrations, whether they be pop celebrations or rave music or rap battles. All of these are ways in which mathematics sort of finds a surprising way to enter into time and show new ways by which it can be discovered in a surprising and felicitous way. So I should like to think that like logic, calculation, which in many ways stands behind and is the sort of governing form of logic, is something that extends the mind and allows it to embrace new possibilities, something that is not foreclosed in its sequence of direct and necessary movements, but always open to new springs of the will that can also be the occasion for overcoming any specter of its inner necessity.
So I think this also connects to the distinction that I was drawing earlier, which is really important to convey between sort of different images of freedom. So I think that there's a particular kind of side to some certain strands of romanticism and other movements kind of in that sort of counter enlightenment vein, which can kind of have the effect of reducing sort of a more positive freedom that would be associated with the connection between thought and action to a kind of sort of phantasmatic freedom, which would just be a relationship between desire and satisfaction. And this is something that can occur when people are, I think, a little bit too like logophobic and have a tendency to sort of see any form of rational mediation of their efforts as again, like undermining themselves through sort of like, oh wow, what if this instrument sort of autonomizes and overcomes me? And I mean, I think kind of the only way to sort of stand against that, as I was also just saying earlier, is sort of see the capacity for mediation in other forms. I think beauty is kind of the classical example, which could sort of be, forces for good autonomization. That it's like, there is this way that the work that you do, even as something that is rationally and logically mediated, autonomizes itself from you and overcomes you, but it does this in a way where it's like, oh, this is something that glorifies God, this is something that glorifies goodness as something that I'm participating in, rather than sort of seeing, and I think a lot of what's happened with secular modernity is that it's seen as this opposition between the only thing bigger than me is something evil. It's like sort of, the forces of cosmic necessity that I am sort of tragically and individually struggling against. So this idea kind of becomes that it's like, on the one hand, you have this pessimism of like, wow, like the individual can never express themselves. On the other hand, you have this sort of individualism, which is like, but nevertheless, the individual is constantly trying to express themselves. But this is all because there isn't sort of this connection to a supernatural higher principle that could be glorified beyond the individual and sort of recognize that it's like, yes, like kind of our material individuality is sort of subsumed under higher principles, but those can be sort of, not just benign, but even like genuinely good higher principles that we can participate in and serve. And I think with that kind of perspective in mind, really all sorts of otherwise seemingly compromising forms of pursuits, stuff like, consequences of enlightenment and sort of contemporary technology, stuff that, certain kinds of people with traditionalist mindsets might be averse to for sometimes very understandable reasons. These things can kind of, through this effort of connecting to sort of higher principles of actual divine goodness, I feel like those sorts of efforts are completely indispensable right now. And it's one of the biggest tragedies that you tend to have this sort of logic of specialization that also extends to like people will become super specialized in sort of the corner of spiritual or moral reflection, and then people will become super specialized in the corner of like handling the mass of contemporary technical knowledge independent of that. When it's like, I feel like the only way that both of those things could actually be good, and this applies even to stuff like spiritual guidance, the only way that both could be meaningfully good for people right now is that they sort of enter into a dialogue with each other, because the farther apart that they remain, the stupider that both of them will become, and the less moral that both of them will become. So
There's another question. Theological discussion point. What does Christ's blood entering the earth, entering Mater/Matter, imply about hope in techniques? I.e., is Christ being consumed even by consumers, unconsciously, of course, but the qualities and energies of Christ are undermining attempts to treat matter as dead and merely stuff? Any more thoughts?
Right. So one of the myths that we sort of encountered while we were here in Crete, while at the Ida cave, was the myth of the birth of the dactyloi. And they were said to have been born when their mother dug her fingers, all 10 of her fingers, into the earth, as though she were with her techne, or the tool use of her fingers, that she were sort of phallically penetrating the earth, and with her the blood of childbirth also sort of drawing forth the possibility of the future servants of Hephaestus, who would go on to become the servants of crafts and sort of teach crafting to the Cretans and thereafter to the Greek world. Now, this suggests to me that there's a parallel here with Christ, who is, as the incarnate Logos, also himself contains the not only Logos, but also techne, that is the objective automation of the syllogism in forms of machines and computers, but also in the plural trace of their power to change the world, that is their tool use that can be virtually simulated from computers, all of the possibilities of entering in and engaging the causal forces of the world with computers, and their grammar, that is their techniques over time. So, or you might say the grammar of the digital, by which, as it were, computers are scripting the sequence of their mechanical operations and shaping the world at a distance. So what I'd like to say about this is that the blood of Christ is sort of fecund with every possible form of not only interpretation, but also in particular with the objective manifestations of that in tool use, and indeed also with the forms of technology that we associate it thereafter with today. And now, of course, it doesn't show it directly in the use of blood. So we were discussing briefly the Eucharistic miracles, where we find, for instance, the wafer sort of turned into hearts with certain blood types. Now, it's not exactly what I'm referring to. It's not, for instance, to say that like sort of like the Alien film series, that like the blood of Christ turns into like xenomorphs or into some kind of like technically augmented powers. Rather, what I'm saying is that as the recollection of the possibility of knowing God, and knowing God transparently through the human intellect, but also of knowing all things as God knows all things, that we always are called by this expectation to come to know the world more fully, and in doing so, to create means by which we can come to the world, to know the world in just that way. So on the one hand, we can see this in the way that I've described in my essay, Sacramental Engines, that the tools, whether it be the rubrics of the liturgy, or indeed today video cameras and the you might say video learning of the Mass, but also the ways by which it's serialized in various media, are the kind of remote matter that stand adjacent to the form of the consecration of the blood and wine, of the blood and the body in the bread and wine of the Eucharistic host and in the Catholic Mass. And in doing so, also that it gathers together, a bit like the Oriental Magi, all of the technical powers of the world to surround and venerate the God who comes to be present amongst us, and the God who promises the possibility of coming to know the world. There's another way in which we can say that liturgical culture also sustains the possibility of technical culture. So one of the dangers we face today is that we may, as it were, be undermining the possibility of technical evolution, precisely because we've lost the possibility of spiritual hope in its higher salvific, felicitous, and agapeic destiny. That is, we may be denying to ourselves the possibility of a creation of felicitous forms of technology that are life-sustaining and give love to neighbor and call that neighborly expectation back to us in more profound and productive ways, because we have gathered together all technical force under titans of control, a bit like the Titan Kronos, who consumed his own children, the possibility in the expectation that in doing so he could preserve his life indefinitely. And in doing so, like the socialist critique of capitalism, we may find that our elevation of technical power to the pinnacle of domination, in fact, undermines its own foundations and it's the continuity of time. So rather, what I suggest is that we have to sort of go lower in order to go higher. We have to look to the possibility that it's in the symbols and rites, perhaps even of the rite of the expectation of God come amongst us in the image of a baby who can, as it were, give his love for us thereafter, that we can sustain a technological culture that can enhance our powers in the future, our powers that are not for ourselves but for another, but become more so precisely in being given to another. And I think that's the true message of the blood of Christ that spreads through technological channels and through our augmentation and empowerment of the world.
So I think the sort of take it back to the Valiant theme that I am providing here today. One concept from me that I haven't really spoken on much is the very, very central idea of affliction in her theology, and the way that she differentiates affliction from suffering, and she sees it as sort of this central negative mystery of creation, that sort of unlike a suffering which would be sort of experienced in a way that preserves one's soul and that one can overcome while still remaining sort of fundamentally within a space of humanity. She defines affliction as sort of this process which is impossible even to will, because it takes away one's capacity for willing. It takes away one's even sort of any felt sense of connection to one's soul. It sort of reduces the human being to just a completely kind of contemptible, materially sort of basic entity that is without any connection to freedom. And so one of the sort of key terms of Ve's Christian theology is to see the particular power of this idea of, you know, Christ on the cross as kind of God himself taking on this burden of affliction, which she's sort of looking for this, where is this redemptive power in this affliction? I feel like one angle on it, there are multiple different threads that she draws out from this, but one angle on it that I find kind of particularly germane also to the discussions that we're having today is the way that, and this is sort of my own wording here, but the affliction is specifically the way that affliction is taken on by God as the sort of absolute principle of even creation itself, is that it forms a kind of scale transition between necessity and the good. So it's like specifically this process, and I think that one of Ve's faults is that she doesn't really emphasize the role of the resurrection enough. But if you look at the kind of space between the crucifixion and the resurrection, and this sort of process of, like, you know, affliction as something that sort of indicates an opening to the good, as sort of like, you know, the heights of actual worldly kingship are in the state of affliction, the highest and the lowest correspond. It's because sort of the order of cosmic necessity, which is sort of this reflexive, egoic, or perspectival exposure that we have, what we sort of take to be the order of things reflexively without ourselves and decreating ourselves, that this is sort of an illusory form of power and authority, that when we sort of the more we try to pursue this, the more it contradicts itself, it undermines itself. No earthly king is an actual king, is actually powerful. And the most power you possibly can have is sort of to pass through this sort of, you know, and even with all of it's a possibility for a non-divine being, sort of pass through this horizon of affliction. And what you know, which pulls sort of cosmic necessity out of itself into ultimate good. It sort of demonstrates, on the one hand, in almost the skeptical way, the contradictions of creation, and on the other hand, opens to resurrection through this scale that is in and beyond creation itself, and returns creation to itself through this ultimate gift of agapeic love. So I think this, when you sort of look at this whole process this way, it does definitely help to see how cosmic power, true cosmic power, has to also be beyond the limit of the cosmos. That true cosmic power also is sort of a supernatural power, and it's a power that recognizes that there are that to actually sustain goodness, you have to open to being made weaker. You have to open to being made smaller. You have to open to sort of restricting your thirst for power and your thirst for control, because those things are contradictory. Those things are self-undermining. And the principle of what actually resurrects itself in the fundamental supernatural order of being, which is the only thing that can guarantee its actuality and consistency, these are things that might superficially appear to be small and weak, and which kind of require the integration even of the afflicted into those processes.
We have another question. Oh, could you read them? Yeah.
From Zolo. Hey, I've been thinking about how this cosmic mythic arc you're working with, from Hesiod to Plato to Teilhard, intersects with more esoteric traditions. What are your thoughts on Plutarch as a practitioner of the esoteric, particularly in relation to his writings on Egyptian religion? Do you see his Isis and Osiris as an early philosophical mediation on techniques or cosmotechnics in any way?
Well, I'm not familiar explicitly with Plutarch's reading of the Egyptian mysteries. One thing we have discussed repeatedly is how the Egyptian mystery traditions, their wisdom, the wisdom perhaps of the Egyptian priests, is passed on through the Greeks to the Western tradition, through the Hermetic tradition that sought to revive it, and also this lure of ancestral thinking that is sort of rooted in the depths of the Egyptian sands continues as a kind of call to summon that archaic wisdom that persists to the present day. So what I would say is particular to Plutarch is that I think Middle Platonism in many ways is trying to refound the possibility of, after dogmatism and skepticism, of a systematic metaphysics that had been lost under imperial skepticism, but also under the various wars, whether it's the Hellenistic era or the Roman era. And in doing so, also to refound something like the sacred mysteries that are, in the case of Plutarch, answerable to the Oracle of Delphi and the revelatory origins of the Greek past. Now, it happens at the same time as Christianity, which is interesting in that it forms a kind of competitive revelation, one that we saw most explicitly with Julian the Apostate and with the Nicene Christian Orthodoxy developed contemporaneous with it. So with regard to the the Egyptian mysteries, the exciting thing about them, I think, for our present purposes, is that they are always communicated in a way that carries with it, on the one hand, the mystery of the hieroglyphs, that is the possibility that there is a kind of pictorial but perhaps ideographic form of learning that is inscrutable to a syllabolic form of speech that developed after the Minoans, after Linear A and Linear B, and thereafter with classical Greek speech. On the other hand, we have this expectation because of the immense engineering proficiency of the ancient Egyptians that it must have involved something like sacred geometry. That it's inconceivable that they could have accomplished so much with the cutting of stone without also understanding how geometrical principles were oriented to something more themselves. And one thing that we discussed earlier is that the earliest papyri that we have that has writing that we can decipher speaks of how the stones that were being brought to the Giza Plateau were being used to build not a pyramid, which is a Greek word, but to build Khufu's horizon. That is the horizon of life that enters into death, but perhaps also something like the horizon that is reshaped by the pyramid itself. That is by sacred geometry, the pyramidal form that becomes a way of changing the world precisely through its construction. And I think all of that is a potent metaphor for how technology is imbued with this geometrical expectation. In many ways, it's a way of thinking about the motion of geometrical forms and how those motions can be molecularly constructed and also, you might say, chemically combusted to form new assemblages, and ones that can be done so in a viral way across different human communities, but always with the expectation that we're not just conceiving of, but recreating the world, and recreating the world in a way that gestures to its origin, but also to its end, and calls upon that mythic expectation that we're doing something in continuity with the gods, and for which the gods have a role to play, and perhaps God himself in the Christian tradition is calling us to its final end. So I think in a way we're like Plutarch today. We're trying to find the revelatory sources of the Oracle of Delphi that can speak through the medium of our new philosophical techniques, and as those techniques happen in our time, to be preeminently orchestrated through digital computers and cybernetic systems.
So all I know about Plutarch is from secondary sources. But what I will say here is that specifically in relation to Isis and the sort of mythological position and role of Isis, one of my favorite sources on this is the Egyptologist Jan Osman, who does discuss Plutarch a little bit as well. I do think it's interesting that specifically the symbol of the veil of Isis is very significant for conceiving of the concept of nature itself and the connection of sort of like humans to nature. And there's this French philosopher, Pierre Hadot, who his book on philosophy of nature is just called The Veil of Isis. And he appeals to, I forget which Greek philosopher it is, but there's that one line about nature loves to hide, that it's sort of always sort of Heraclitus. Okay, sort of behind a veil, and that there's something sort of occulted or esoteric fundamentally about this relation to nature. That I feel like kind of only is sort of, and I think this is an irreducible kind of necessary perspective for human beings to have in relation to nature, that there is something just esoteric constitutively about our reality. And that the only sort of way out of this is then supernatural revelation itself kind of has to, is the only sort of way to think about what is exoteric, that there is sort of like, there's no way out of sort of this esoteric circle. One thing that does interest me about Isis is that it does seem like a lot of the Isis cult, and specifically with this sort of concept of the veil, it has a certain similarity to the way that God is treated in the Old Testament, and sort of this idea of like no man can see God and live, that it's like, or it's sort of impossible to behold Isis kind of beyond the veil. And that I think this does have to do with the sense in which these divine figures are maybe not articulated strictly in terms of love, but involve kind of wrath, constraint, necessity, dominance, power. And those sorts of principles kind of have this effect of like, because they have this contradictory horizon, or they're sort of like embedded within the space where contradiction is operative at the limit of the cosmos, they sort of have to be mediated. What's interesting about Christ and about Christian religion is that God then kind of becomes this mediation itself. So it's less that God is this sort of overpowering force that then has to be mediated through kind of this like esoteric sort of obscuring, which is also the case in our relation to nature because of nature's force and power. There's also this additional effect of Christ's incarnation, which is that mediation is brought back into God himself. So it's like no longer are you sort of held back from this full connection to God without destroying yourself, which implies that theosis, or achieving the highest form of yourself, is a form of radical self-destruction. You are sort of now actually affirmed and reconfirmed in your own incarnation through God's incarnation as a principle of mediation of the entire universe. So I feel like that's part of the sort of novelty of Christianity, and the way that it also sort of serves as like a culmination of all previous religious systems. But also in this way, like, I think it's impossible to sort of say that this, just because mediation is folded back into God in Christianity, that means that you've sort of overcome all of the problems of the necessarily esoteric status of nature and the problem of the veil of Isis. I do kind of have this tendency to talk about like seeing the ultimate goal of my project as like tearing away the veils of Isis and stuff. But like sort of part of what I see as the implication of that is that what is we're sort of faced with then with this decision point between a God that itself has mediation within itself, which is the saving power of Christ, and kind of this sort of losing ourselves to the overcoming sort of destructive, self-autonomizing orientation of cosmic power and necessity that is taken as an idol. So it's like the more you actually expose yourself to esoteric truth, the more you kind of are given this polarized choice of like you are forced, you're pushed towards sort of the side of good or the side of evil, and you sense that there is this polarization, that it's like you can kind of be more neutral and be more you can kind of avoid that choice the less you're exposed to esoteric truth. But the more you are exposed to it, the more you do have to decide, and the more you are really strongly polarized, I think, in a fundamental sense, which is good. I think we need that polarization, and I think that is sort of the ultimate, that is like really what apocalypse means, is it's like the generalization of this exposure to this polarization, actually like more sense of good and evil. And in this connection, this is where I see sort of like the Nietzschean idea of being beyond good and evil is actually counter-apocalyptic. It's sort of like, it's an attempt to kind of undermine this process, where even the Reformation itself, I feel like it had these apocalyptic consequences by kind of introducing this religious chaos into modernity. But it also sort of, in its own sort of stated theology, kind of is resisting apocalypse insofar as it sort of prevents a determinate sense of polarization between good and evil already in Luther's concept of total depravity, which I think Nietzsche kind of just radicalizes away from Christianity itself. So my point is basically just that a true kind of apocalyptic revealing with the world would be this radical polarization where the forces of evil become ever more evil and the forces of good become ever more good. And these two things, the contrast is made extremely clear and determinate in a way where sort of people's destiny is sort of revealed. It's literally an apocalypsis of destiny to themselves. So,
Ready for more questions?
Yes.
Okay. Anonymous attendee asks, he says, or they say, Owen Barfield says, there is scarcely any reference to all language in the phenomena of man, certainly not at the all-important point where it belongs, which is the point of transition from his second to his third period, from passive life, subjectively passive life, to active thought. Barfield adds, in excluding language telehard, renounces all possibility of any understanding of the prehistoric phase in the evolution of consciousness. By contrast, quote, the history of language points towards an initial immersion in a clear lake of meaning, a matrix of super-individual consciousness within which the physical world from its inception has dwelt and from which it emerged. Thoughts on this critique and the Barfield alternative?
Well, it's a wonderful question, and it's something I need to reflect more on. I think Barfield's absolutely right here, that there's something profound in the emergence of language, and not just the initial spark of language, for instance, like the brute grunts of our sort of Neanderthal ancestors, but also the continual development of language as it develops in poetry and literature and how it's now mediated through new channels today. But I would also suggest that the universe before human utterance is not entirely without language either. So we find this, for instance, in bird songs and whale calls. There's a sense in which the universe itself has a kind of language. We might speak, for instance, not only of the harmonia mundi, that is the music of the spheres, but also of the language of the spheres. And as far as it sometimes uttered in discrete grammatical units, or ways that can be analyzed and open to grammatical meaning, perhaps even poetic meaning. And it's for that reason that we can speak of a kind of poetry of nature that's more primitive than the poetry of the way that we give utterance to it in our speech and our letters. That being said, I think that what's unique about language, and the reason why it's the focal point of the myth of Thoth and the origin of writing in Plato's Phaedrus is that language allows us to symbolically represent the world in a way that can be assembled in infinitely new ways. So once we have the possibility of representing the world, we can also assemble those representations indifferent to their material continuity in a way that's almost digital, in that it can construct any world that we wish. We can construct something like the true history of the first science fiction work of the moon people fighting the sun people, or we can create the history of the Peloponnesian War, or we can go on to create Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen and anything in between. And with all this, we have the possibility of creating simulacrum that is separate from and sort of, but at the same time, the gesture to new possibilities within the world. So this is a really exciting idea, and I think that it's absolutely important. It's something that Teilhard de Chardin perhaps overlooked in a very decisive way, and perhaps a way that he can't really be exonerated for. We have philosophy of language dating back to Giovanbattista Vico and to Johann Herder, and through Noam Chomsky and up into the present day. And it's a great question, and one that we've been exploring here at the Ætheria Institute and beyond. But one thing I think it gestures to, something that I wanted to touch upon previously, is the idea that not only are there automations in machines, but there also is the possibility of a sort of resistant counter-automation that Anna had suggested. So in the Greek myth Pygmalion, we have a story about how a sculptor falls in love with his own statue. Now, the interesting thing about the statue, not only is it a woman that seduces him, but also it's a woman that contains beauty within herself. It doesn't sort of show that beauty beyond herself, like Helen of Troy. It's a goddess or a human in the image of the gods who's so beautiful that it enchants and ultimately leads to ruin and destruction. And I would suggest that what makes a great work of art is not something that needs to be beautiful unto itself. There's a short story by Yukio Mishima about the burning down of the Golden Pavilion, whereby something that's so beautiful demands destruction because it overwhelms us and sort of lures us indefinitely, and such that our desire can never be fully satisfied. Rather, I think a great work of art, like perhaps Tolstoy's War and Peace or the Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, requires that it is a comprehensive world that always opens up porously beyond itself, inviting us to participate in it and yet to go beyond it. That is, it has to be a kind of a world of windows that gestures to the possibility of new discoveries and of even powers that come in from without and escape our understanding, such that its beauty is never completely totalized. And moments of beauty are flickering, a bit like wabi-sabi, always fragile, and yet can be reconstituted in ways that are adventitious and more felicitous. And so I suggest that in the present day, the late David Lynch films, whose were always saturated with alternative interpretations that can never congeal into a coherent whole, or the impressionist cinema of Denis Villeneuve and Christopher Nolan that sort of plays with chronologies and with color and shape, or even with the recent film, the recent game Death Stranding, which is in many ways about sort of leaping over the abyss of the digital to find our place within the world that we can only touch with our feet and navigate thereupon. I think these are ways in which we can enter into a world without finding closure within it, and perhaps finding meaning that's more poetic, that escapes the possibility of a merely naturalized expectation of continuity without language and its interruption.
So, on the topic of the philosophy of language, you mentioned to Ryan, did you say Haman? I know you said Herder. But yeah. So Herder was also Haman's student. And the specific lineage in which Haman and Herder were in when they really kind of founded the modern tradition of the philosophy of language, they're Rosicrucians. They're both in the Rosicrucian line of Lutheranism. Herder was a little bit more kind of heterodox even from the Lutheran establishment. Hamann was definitely trying to mix more Orthodox Lutheranism with Rosicrucian mysticism. But Rosicrucianism also is basically just the sort of taking up of the ancient Hermetic tradition within sort of German Lutheran Protestant Christianity. And I mean, when you look at a lot of Hamann's writings on the origin of language and the sort of question of like language as the foundation for philosophical reflection, I mean, they're written literally, like one of them is sort of attributed pseudonymously to the Knight of the Rose Cross. So it's like, it's a very clearly an esoteric orientation in sort of making language foundational to philosophy. I mean, when you look back at like historical traditions that also did this, the Kabbalah is a famous example, but it's like taking the constituents of the Hebrew alphabet itself and like the letter of the of the Torah to kind of sort of build out symbolically a kind of synchronic world of sort of stock world of like these four different realms, and this sort of like how symbols then can kind of connect to specifically linguistic symbols can connect to a metaphysical perspective on all of creation. So I do think that kind of even in like the sort of turn, something of linguistic turn in the 20th century, there was definitely this sort of esoteric backdrop to some of that as well. You have philosophers like Agassiz, like Robson, who kind of argue for this sort of profound sort of overlaps, which in some cases, like in the dissemination essay, or even explicit between Decreating deconstruction and Kabbalah. So I do think actually when you look at the whole history of human thought, what happens whenever you have thought that turns itself towards a language is you end up with this sort of symbolic esotericism. That it's inevitable that the more that language is kind of brought up to consciousness, the more sort of this mysterious symbolic function of like what is this entity of language kind of, you know, on the one hand there's sort of this intoxication with the power of it as you sort of come to deeper insights, but there's also sort of this sense of wonderment at like how language itself is kind of this denaturalizing force, that it's irreducible to kind of a pure conception of like passive phenomenal nature. That language of itself kind of takes the phenomena out of itself. As Jacques Lacan would say, it makes a hole in the real, right? That it's sort of like, in another sense, you can see it as affecting this transition of scales between what is available to the senses and what the word points to, that kind of limits or mediates the capacity for the senses to totalize our experience. I definitely think that language is a connection to the divine and is sort of just genuinely a gift from God, that it's like, it's not so much that it was something that just evolutionarily developed at some point as like an organ for human beings, but is sort of this way that our own diachronic natural history intersects with a synchronic kind of trans-historical realm that humans as the image of God were sort of made to tap into, and that sort of forces a reconsideration of sort of a purely linear conception of natural history. And sort of through language we do see this capacity for the sort of like ultimate synchronicity of all things, sort of in the power of the symbol to allow for this religious mediation. And Simone Weil also actually has an essay called The Power of Words, which does kind of, she's not quite as crazy about it as I am, but she does go into kind of how she thinks that she sees language kind of as this like fundamental alternative to the sort of obsession with controlling force, that language, rather than sort of being this pure controlling capacity, which it might be reduced to in some forms of sort of like left-hand path magic, is it's mediation. It's something that sort of embeds and restricts everything within it, while allowing everything within it also to participate more deeply and discover itself on a higher level than it would have otherwise if it hadn't participated within it.
There's another question on here from Joshua Huang. It says, Kronos is normally depicted as a vengeful tyrant killing his children for power. Why do you think Goya painted him as a madman, horrified by himself, but unable to stop devouring his son?
Well, I had the good pleasure of seeing this painting at the Prado Museum in Madrid, and I've thought an awful lot about Goya. He's a fascinating figure. He's often seen as a romantic or a harbinger of the sort of romantic critiques of the Enlightenment, and it's paired in the Prado Museum with the series of illustrations of titled Enlightenment, of Napoleonic soldiers massacring some of the citizens of Madrid and other Spanish cities. Now, I take it that what's happening is that this is a bit like, well, like William Blake's depiction of Isaac Newton, that what we're meant to be shown is how reason, when carried to its limits, also begins to consume itself, undermines itself, and leads even to the consuming of its own children in a kind of ancestral consumption that is just the opposite of what we previously described in the Christian story of the gift of one's body to become the nourishment for the other and for our whole community that sort of give life thereafter. So I take it that he's trying to present something not simply primordial, but something current, something about the current state of reason in European society and the titanic powers that threaten to consume the youthful offspring that can be the harbinger of something new and felicitous and good. Now, the particular texture of the painting is very sharp and severe, and it's very much a counter to the sublime and the tightly controlled pictures, for instance, that we find in Jacques-Louis David. If you compare it, for instance, to his depiction of Homer and the Olympian gods in a contemporary painting, you'll see that it's almost proto-impressionist in the way that it uses sharp colors and contrasts and almost like Caravaggio, but in a kind of demonic way, the overpowering chiaroscuro to call us into this nightmarish vision, but at the same time to deny the possibility of our complete understanding of what's happening. So I think we're meant to look into ourselves when we see that, but also see how our own expectations of reason at its totalizing completeness can be mirrored and made gargantuan upon the world stage. And it's a question I think remains with us because the Enlightenment has only ever been repeated. You may know, for instance, of David Deutsch and Steven Pinker's New Enlightenment, and the expectation that not only computers but quantum computing can show us the inner computational framework of the entire universe. So this Mathesis Universalis, Descartesian or Leibnizian expectation that we can get to the bottom of the Euclidean algebraic forms of things or the analytical computation of them is still with us and perhaps ever more present. And will come back undoubtedly whenever it is that we have new techniques that give us a kind of perspicacious knowledge of the real. But it's not something that I think that we should ever totally invest ourselves in. Plato recognized in his dialogues that the Pythagoreans had gone awry in expecting that they could come to know all things through calculation, or that there was a way by which, as it were, even the good and the just could be deduced from pure a priori forms. There's a way in which I think we have to be more subtle and plastic about our expectations, open to the possibility of deformation and reassemblage. And I think that's something that endures with patience and hope rather than through any sort of monstrous consuming of the new.
So I don't trust that depiction of the Pythagoreans. That's my main comment on that. I think that the key argument about the Pythagoreans to be made is the idea that the incommensurable ratio, it's a re-embedding of sort of transrational mystery within reason itself. And it then kind of becomes this ultimate esoteric sort of guiding horizon for the sort of Pythagorean like cultic practice or whatever, which like I honestly wish that our scientists today were more like this. That I feel like it'd be way cooler if science was sort of this elaborate cult of calculation rather than it being like this sort of instrumentalist you go into it because you want more stuff kind of mindset that has increasingly developed. The more powerful it's gotten, the more corrupted it's gotten. And sort of there's this sort of almost naive purity of the Pythagorean, like we can calculate our way into sort of the divine mysteries. Also because I just don't think it's possible to evade divine mystery. Literally whatever you're working with, in some sense, if you're open to it, you will perceive it within it. So I don't think that there's any kind of practice that of itself will sort of prevent you from opening that divine mystery. The problem is just, and like this connects like the Christian conception of sin, is that some practices, when you open the divine mystery, you will have to, the more that you sort of receive it and the more that you perceive it, the more that you kind of are forced to transform what you're doing and shift the orientation and the horizon of it. That there are forms of calculation that it's like, even if you encounter sort of this, you encounter some limitation within them that opens to something higher. You develop this sense of the transition between scales that takes you from being sort of more within yourself to being more open to the divine. That the more you sort of experience that, the more you sort of have to shift even the form in which you were first pursuing what you were doing. And sometimes this is what, for example, Hegel is trying to do with his whole system, regardless of your issues with the many ways that he can be sort of considered to have failed. And I think it's true that he did in many ways. The sort of basic sentiment that guides Hegel and all of his work is sort of this, like, well, you can start from where you start from, and then you just sort of draw out of that starting point this through kind of the contradictions within it. You can kind of, and this is, Vey has a very similar concept of like, the good is always past the horizon of a contradiction. You identify a contradiction, you identify a mystery, and then sort of through this higher level mediation within those contradictory incommensurable terms, the basic Pythagorean gnosis, within those terms, you then are capable of moving to a higher level, participating in kind of a deeper reality than the one that had been transparent to you before, which also reflects back and reconditions where you had been before you had achieved this position.
I'd like to follow that up. Do we have any more questions? Okay, so I'll follow up briefly and then we can go on. So you may remember the story of Hippasus, who was sunk in the Straits of Sicily because he had discovered incommensurable numbers. And I think this suggests that there's two kinds of Pythagoreans that we're dealing with. And there's one that is repeated in Iamblichus when he describes the acousmaticoi and the logismoi, I believe, the calculators and the musicians, the people who, as it were, celebrated the musical rites on the one hand, which perhaps are the more conservative Pythagoreans, and the followers perhaps of Archytas, who are more invested in the possibility of a kind of dictatorial use of reason to master the world. And I would suggest that the latter came undone and was suppressed and recognized their futility and was recognized there afterwards because of their almost like their sort of logomachic hubris. That is, they thought that they could, as it were, summon the Titans through the use of calculation. And what's interesting for me, however, here, so the Pythagorean discovery of irrational magnitudes has often been alluded to as the first sort of discovery of the criteria of falsification for a scientific research paradigm. That is, the possibility that a mathematical project was falsifiable and self-defeating. But it's interesting because it's also suffused, of course, with religious expectation, so it's a kind of religion that proves its own falsity. But what is astonishing to me is it also overthrows the world. So if the passage of the gods is a kind of apocalypse, that is the death of the gods and the new gods that come thereafter, then this mathematical self-discovery of its own paradigm obsolescence is also a kind of apocalypse. And this suggests that every undermining of our own rational expectations, whether it be in a scientific research project on the larger scale, or perhaps even in an expectation of judgment of how we can come to know the world more fully, perhaps even writing our own essays or books, is itself somehow apocalyptic. But at the same time, it's not a canceling of all human effort or obstruction to it indefinitely, but it's a, you might say, an obstacle that we have to navigate around in order to find where it is those hidden gods on the road can yet be found. And if that's the case, then not only is apocalypticism sort of recurrent, but it's also perhaps even accelerating. And the acceleration of that polarity is something that is occasioned by and concurrent with human creativity, such that we can't, as it were, as you were saying previously, stand beyond good and evil, because the tension of good and evil remains with us, and every attempt to sort of get away from it is yet another choice that we have to make within a morally valent framework. So might we say that, and we can go on to the questions after this, that we're always sort of finding new modes of participation in the avenues of discovering mediation, yet even those assemblages of immediacy can become immediate, can become kitsch over time, and yet that very kitschness can be repeated and reshaped in a new and creative way.
So just to respond to the question of the was it Hippasus was his name? So Leonore Leet argues that the story has been corrupted, and that what actually happened was not that Hippasus discovered the numbers, but sort of irrational numbers and incommensurable ratios, but that he tried to reveal it to people outside of the Pythagorean cult. So I mean, and this is something that's claimed by people like the Lindisfarne group, who Leet is part of. That it's sort of like the and I mean, I think it makes more sense as a claim to me, that, you know, I feel like there's sort of this vulgar idea, like, that's kind of relating Pythagoreans to contemporary sort of secularizing scientists, and the entire idea of a secularizing scientist is a post-Christian notion, and it's like sort of trying to free a particular kind of natural scientific investigation from sort of the strictures of a particular set of dogmatic assumptions that are sort of brought in by the church, that might kind of be meddling in some cases where it doesn't belong. But sort of before this sort of question of the relationship between Christian religion and science, what was sort of the horizon of a lot of these efforts of calculation, this was a spiritual practice. Like, when it wasn't specifically kind of a logistical engineering effort, as it was in many ancient civilizations, in cases like the Pythagoreans, like, and this is really the origin of like our concept of philosophy in many ways, like, and this is something that Simone Weil talks about in her writings on the Pythagoreans, is that it's a spiritual practice. It's literally a sacramental practice, where what was sort of being undertaken was a sort of attempt to connect to a deeper divine mystery. And if there is a flaw of the Pythagoreans, I think it's arguably less the Titanism, which I think is sort of a projection back in the time. I mean, even in I guess Euclid does tell the story of Hippasus, so I guess you could say that even that early there was sort of this rejection of the Pythagoreans as having this Titanic conception of reason. But I think, I don't know, to me, maybe this is just a fan fiction, but to me it makes a lot more sense to say that the sort of ultimate flaw of the Pythagoreans, and this could also be confirmed by the fact that so few of their writings have come down to us, is the fact that they were greedy with their gnosis, that they didn't want to share it outside of the cult. And that I think this is one of the biggest problems with you know, all through the history of anyone who's actually tried to cultivate themselves spiritually, that it's like, and I think there are two sides to this. On the one side, it's the problem of you know, if you don't share it, it's sort of lost to time, and it becomes something also that sort of inordinately gives deeper power to the particular group that employs it and deploys it. There's also the other side of it, that it makes the insights weaker, and also it sort of fails to purge those insights of their own limitations that would be kind of that they would be more presented with, the more that they are exposed to people from outside of the initiation into the cult and the particular faith that it has to defend, that faith, what is actually at stake in that faith, becomes more determinate the more that it is presented to people who do not share it. And so you actually learn more deeply what are the conditions for the kind of attainment that is expected of you. And I think this is also kind of the interesting way that revealed religion passes over from salvation by gnosis to a kind of salvation by what is necessarily an articulation of both gnosis and pistis, or faith. That it's like, if you just have, you can have the illusion, you can sustain the illusion in kind of an esoteric cult that you're saved just by gnosis, because you take faith for granted because everyone is initiated into the faith. But if it's more exoteric, then what you have is you have kind of the determination of a distinction where some people are capable or have already demonstrated their openness to the capacity to invest in a kind of faith that opens to the gnosis. But then that actually itself is already a condition to the gnosis. So it's not like the gnosis itself is transparent, but that faith is also already a condition for entering into that space.
Well, if as Alfred North Whitehead said, all philosophy is footnotes to Plato, we might say that all philosophy today is fan fiction of the Pythagoreans. Do we have any more questions, though?
There was a comment in the chat from Angel. Cartoonish wars between good and evil. Is that really what the myths of Apocalypse and Ragnarok actually point to? An overly Catholic reading of Nietzsche drifts from the implications placed within the narrative he's enumerating upon.
I don't know if Angel is in a great position to be critiquing cartoonishness personally. I mean, if you're drawing on anime to the extent that he does, I feel like if anything, it's actually kind of a virtue to see it as a form of intensification of standard presentations of reality. But I don't know. I mean, this is sort of a genuine question or a genuine issue that I think needs to be litigated more seriously. It's not just something that can kind of be insisted upon, that it's like, oh, you can't go between good and evil and you have to choose a side and all of this. That I think that there is sort of this case of like, on some level, you do have this problem of like, what good and evil actually are and how they're expressed. Oftentimes, like, to even open up to that, you kind of do need all of these moments that you have to pass through of kind of like perpetually or sort of sifting through assumptions that no longer hold in the sort of binaristic forms that they might have before. And what this ultimately takes is sort of to see that goodness is, in some basic sense, and this is something that I think I might have to concede to Angel in certain ways, sort of critiquing things that I've said in the past, is that goodness is not really something that can be held in especially imminent ways, that through the effort of this polarization, you actually see more and more how goodness is sort of fundamentally such a radically transcendent thing, that the only way that more imminent things can actually partake of it is through participation in this radical transcendence. And so in this sense, a skepticism of all imminent things to have any kind of participation in goodness and to have any capacity to struggle directly with evil as sort of this, maybe more Zoroastrian or Gnostic struggle, in some basic sense, it's not so much a direct confrontation as it is that some things just opening to an ultimate transcendent goodness, and other things sort of just failing to open to this and then all mutually destroying themselves. So in some sense, the cartoonish struggle would be really between evil and evil, and the goodness sort of functions as goodness precisely by kind of bypassing the mutual self-destruction of the forces which fail to participate in the transcendent good.
There is a follow-up question from Shayed Farms. So what is human goodness?
Well, I would follow up with what Anna had said, that goodness can't just be a kind of resituation of the opposition to the evil, because that simply reframes that agonistic conquest, that contest between one party and another, as though it has to conquer the other using the same instruments of domination that were arrayed against it. So it can't just be the, as it were, peace that is established through war and a kind of cycle of opposites that continues forever afterwards. Rather, we have to find a way of inwardly canceling the possibility of becoming evil, that is, of showing ourselves to be one of the contestants for this eternal conflict of wills. So we find this, for instance, in Hegel's master-slave dialectic, where initially it seems that the only way by which you can assert yourself and become self-consciousness is by risking the possibility of death, that is your own obliteration, so that in that risk you become more violent than the other and become courageous in such a way that you can dominate the other. But in doing so, you only frame the occasion by which, as it were, by instrumentalizing the other, they become the arbiters of that own instrumentalization and ultimately control the world in such a way that you can then thereafter be reciprocally just defeated and dominated by the class of slaves that you'd formerly presumed yourself to be the master over. So the only way of canceling the cycle of violence is to find a source of reconciliation, of forgiveness, and of mutual embrace that can't be simply forced upon the other, but has to be invited from the other. And I think this is the way by which we answer not only the class antagonisms, as we find, for instance, in Alexander Kojev's reading of Hegel, but something like also the legacy of colonialism, of the legacy of the domination of one group over another in so many ways, and perhaps also emergingly today of the way by which the concentration of wealth and power in the people who control the means of technological augmentation are exercising their force over others to perhaps even reestablish something like that class hierarchy or that slave class that had formerly prevailed in the ancient world. So we have to find a way that we can reinterrogate the fundamental forms of technology so that it can be open to something like that forgiving and reconciling yay, by which people who were formerly arrayed as opposites and enemies can see each other as friends and perhaps even neighbors worthy of divine love.
And yeah, I do think that for something like that to happen, there does have to be like some very fundamental re-experiencing of supernatural truth. That I don't think something like that, like that kind of like you know, idea of sort of all humanity enemies to lovers arc. Um, I just don't think that's something that can happen without an immense sort of combination of two sides. On the one hand, an immense loss of natural transparency, which would probably have to be in some level cataclysmic, or sort of decreationistic. And on the other hand, a sort of necessary initiation into a beholding of the supernatural conditions of that unity. And this is something that is historically, like, does have historical precedent, that like every example of sort of the success and the spread of major religions, whether or not you kind of can question some aspects of their ultimate degree of connection with the divine source. In every case, those are sorts of experiences of collective exposure to supernatural connection. And I think that is kind of what ultimately will be sort of the only possible vector for mass reconciliation, is sort of this revival of collective sort of sensing of spiritual presence that also sort of continually undermines the limitations of that sensing in a form that would sort of destroy its actual transformative power.
There's one question, or there's two more questions, probably unrelated, but since Anna brought up China earlier, how does Yukhui?
Yes.
Yukhui's The Question Concerning Technology in China, an essay in Cosmotechnics, connect to this topic? That was asked a bit earlier.
Yes, so Yukui is the culminating figure in the tradition of secular cybernetics that I trace from Martin Heidegger through Gilbert Simondon through Bernard Stiegler. Yukui is someone who wrote his doctoral dissertation on reconciling Heidegger and Simondon, but who also is deeply indebted to Bernard Stiegler and arguably the foremost exponent of the school of cybernetic philosophy that he's inherited from him. So he's certainly relevant here. The key, however, is that the essay concerning cosmotechnics is one that seeks to find a non-Occidental way of narrating the mythic history of technology, one that escapes, on the one hand, from the kind of Whig progressive development from simplicity to complexity that promises with it all social advancement, or that would be carried along naively from there. On the other hand, from Heidegger's skepticism of the Platonic amnesia of the questioning of being that sets in with the forms of metaphysics that are carried on there afterwards, whether it be in the Platonic tradition or the Scholastic tradition, and in doing so also from a purely Western narrative trajectory that regards technology with suspicion, as something that has to be overcome by a kind of tragic agon that opens up to a higher destiny. And in particular, he's concerned about the legacy of Greek tragedy as something that frames all of our conceptions about the overcoming of evil and also of, you might say, the technological augmentation of forces of evil in the Western world. So he presents, on the one hand, Taoist philosophy of a kind of sharing with one another and overcoming one another by, or you might say not overcoming, but sharing the sensibilities of the other such that you can pass through one another. But on the other hand, the paintings that dominated the landscape school of the Northern Song dynasty and that became emblematic of a way of passing through the veil of the mist, such that you can see emergent forms within it and just as ephemeral and fragile as they've become. So I would suggest that Yu Kui is a felicitous figure that welcomes a variety of different cosmological and cosmotechnical horizons, and ones that are open the possibility of exiting from a kind of Heideggerian or even Nietzschean suspicion of the death of the gods or the obsolescence of Western metaphysics that had formerly been the avenue for discovering theological truth. And that in as far as he does this, his cosmotechnical pluralism is also a kind of plural relativation of the possibility of myth-making and also of discovering the hidden sources of revelation that sustain our technological cultures and orient our technological destiny. So I see him as a pivotal figure, but one that is perhaps not final. And I say not final because I see him as someone who opens up a kind of space of emergent discursive possibilities, but one in which religious voices, whether it be Catholic or specifically Jesuit, can enter into. And those Jesuit ones also in which re-inaugurate a kind of post-Suarezian metaphysical framework and horizon in which the writings, for instance, of Henri de Lubac and Answers from Balthasar, as well as the Ressourcement movement and radical orthodoxy and new Trinitarian ontology, all have a place in our cybernetic discussions and the way we understand tool use as the horizon of the gods for today.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I could say briefly, I think one of the most significant things about China and part of why Yu Kui as a Chinese philosopher has become so significant to a lot of these discussions is just the sort of historical, I guess you could say contingent, although I think that there is a deeper significance to it, fact of the way that Chinese civilization kind of is to such an extent a kind of autonomously constructed form of civilization from Western civilization that reached sort of similar heights of advancement without a significant amount of sort of borrowing from the historical sources of Western civilization. So it's like through that kind of comparative effort between what for Yu Kui specifically are these like extremely different cosmological horizons. This is why China kind of becomes this really powerful like sort of world historical foil that it's like, I mean, even the concept of cosmotechnics as we developed it is basically just this idea of like how you use technology. And this is like what I've been talking about like all through this day. How you use technology is fundamentally colored by your cosmological horizons. And so how you think about cosmology and specifically kind of like the sort of symbolic cosmology of not just sort of a scientific standpoint, but a sort of philosophical standpoint that it's open to spiritual forces. And this is like largely his sort of like his profiling of Taoist and Confucian traditions and concepts like qi and like how they fit into Chinese cosmology historically. How that orients your social, cultural, and even individual uses of technology does fundamentally transform sort of the style of the techniques that are being deployed. And I think style isn't even the right word because it's like just even everything about the sort of form and fundamentally the telos, because what is a tool except something that is oriented towards a telos? So if your cosmological telos is different and how you even would express it has sort of a fundamentally different set of priorities, then what the tool is cannot be the same thing. Even if it's the same form, even if it's the same like, oh, I'm using like a particular sort of technological invention to do a certain thing, if the thing is sort of embedded within these different teleological trajectories, then that actually transforms the thing. It's a little bit like transubstantiation. Like it's like it has a similar kind of sense in which, you know, the material entity might be the same, but the actual significance and meaning of the thing is completely different, and what it may even presence within itself for being within that teleological orientation is different. So on a kind of a purely historical level, just the comparison of China and the West can can allow you to see things this way. That it's like you sort of have this parallax perspective difference where it's like you're looking at it from a Chinese perspective, Chinese cosmology, you're looking at it from a Western perspective, Western cosmology, and like even without entering into a space of some kind of faith in specific supernatural forces, you can kind of just through these comparisons kind of derive like, wow, like like telos matters, cosmological horizon matters, cultural differences are sort of in themselves can be seen to be downstream from this teleological question. And yeah, I think that that's what we're continually confronting with contemporary technological development and with sort of I mean, I think to some extent cybernetics is sort of a lost dream. Like I kind of wish Heidegger was more right that cybernetics would overcome metaphysics because I mean, the basic premise of cybernetics, I do see it as in many ways neo-Pythagorean, in that it's like the idea of a sort of pure transdisciplinary scientific organization of inquiry. So it's like every different kind of STEM discipline would sort of have some position within the overall cybernetic body, and cybernetics would become kind of this meta theoretical sort of worldview that allowed all of these different scientific disciplines to translate themselves into each other, make sense of themselves through each other. And of course, this did not really come to pass in that form. And cybernetics was sort of, there was the passage from the first order to second order cybernetics where it was like sort of having to reflect itself back onto itself. And this leads to this question of this recursion where it's like, why is this not working? And so, I mean, I do think that there was sort of this, and maybe, this goes back to Ryan's critique of the Pythagoreans, there was sort of this Titanistic aspect to cybernetics where it was like this idea of it kind of becoming this meta theoretical unifying force for all of scientific inquiry was just not really possible. But it is also funny, and like I was talking about this with Stella recently as actually one of the things about cybernetics that I do want to sort of set into dialogue with the metaphysical tradition is that through sort of a lot of specifically kind of Christian Europe, pre-modern, early modern Christian Europe, whether it's sort of within the sort of original developments of what became universities, or whether it's in kind of the sort of early modern developments, kind of before, especially before like really almost up to the 19th century, or sorry, the 18th, the 19th century. What you saw was that largely because of the religious homogeneity, you kind of had this capacity to have, so like every different discipline within a university would be related to all the other disciplines in a way that could be made metaphysically determinate. So it's not so much that it's like, the sort of contingent assortment of different disciplinary specialized trajectories that you have now, which is sort of, it's just very kind of like schizophrenic, and like every different discipline would have a completely different idea of how it relates to every other discipline. But if you kind of have this more integrated kind of corporatistic metaphysical sort of context for how all of the different parts in a sort of shared space of intellectual inquiry fit together, then sort of the power of that, even if you see religious homogeneity as a high price for it, the power of that is that each different sort of piece is like it's just like it's like a body. It's just more effective at coordinating with the other pieces in order to achieve a particular teleological purpose. And I think this is a lot of what kind of got lost in sort of the modern intoxication with mechanical scientific success that kind of overloaded the whole rest of university as a sort of vocation, and kind of transformed research and the cultivation of intellectual capacities into something that would just be increasingly just a means of accumulation rather than something that helped to continually integrate and organize shared cultural telos. So
That's another question. For Coleridge or Ibn Arabi, is it important to say we are co-creators with God, or is human imagination as sub-creation, Tolkien's view, enough?
Well, I don't know that they're necessarily conflicting. So, in as far as we say that we're co-creators, we say that we cooperate with divine creation. While at the same time, in as far as we can say that we're sub-creators, we say that we do so in a kind of without a complete capacity to create from nothing. That is, creating with something rather than from nothing. So these two views, I think, are consistent. Now, Origen of Alexandria, I think, stands on more the side of co-creators, because he doesn't regard creation as something that we can fully grasp, or that we as it were, we stand alongside of. So he regards the activity of the the rational beings uniformly and continuously as involved in the activity of creation. So he describes how all rational beings emerge from a single point, a single act of creation, perhaps, but all rational beings are also involved in the continual creation of the physical world. So the stars and the planets are the creation of the angels, but also continuously so. The stars themselves are visible manifestations of invisible angelic spirits, and so on with rivers and streams and so on. And even in this, with the possibility here of neutral intermediary spirits like fairies that are involved in a kind of chaotic creation of the world and perhaps amongst us. So humans are then sort of stand alongside as co-creators with the angels rather than necessarily with God, who for whom's creation we can't fully know. I think the idea of subcreation is more in the Augustinian legacy, where we regard the divine act of creation as something that is instant and eternal and continuous thereafterwards, and for which our act of creation is always a kind of answering to that original creation. But it brings into question the possibility of, you might say, radical emergence, or the possibility of something that can ostensibly come from nowhere within the world. And so many of the artistic productions of humankind, and arguably language, poetry, and everything that has arisen thereafterwards in successive epochs of human culture doesn't have any natural precedent. So it seems as though it does come from some source of ingenuity that is beyond the world. This is why we regard the artist as the closest to divine, possessing what Plato called theomania, that is the madness of the gods or the god. Now, that being said, I don't think that we have to regard it entirely as Luciferian, although I think it can often tend to that direction. And perhaps something of what we've been discussing of the creation of autonomous worlds or spheres of artistry suggests that we can create a new world that is unlike anything in the present world, while at the same time borrowing aspects of the world and doing so in a way that only happens to coincide in various fragmentary ways with what makes our own world true and beautiful and just. So I should hope that we don't have to choose between these alternatives, between, on the one hand, a subordinate position and a cooperative position, but that we can find in each, that is, whether it be assuming kind of abject subordination on the one hand in order to recognize our own humility, something like they in Decreating, recognizing that the possibility of genuine sympathy comes from shared sense of absence or affliction, or on the other hand, that we can strive with one another in mutual virtue, the way that Aristotle recommends and the way that we see in Homer, and perhaps even amongst the great poets of the Olympian tradition, to give better and better rhapsodic poems to the future. And I think both of those are callings that await us yet to come.
That was the final question on there. I have a few questions for myself. I guess, do you see artificial intelligence as sort of like a summoning of some kind of ancient force? And how do you see that as potentially connected to the fall of Atlantis and where we are at today with the Ashton?
Right. So I really wanted to talk about Atlantean tech. So we were exploring the ruins of Atlantis as far as we had come to it yesterday. We were informed by credible sources that we had come to the bosom of the volcanic eruption that had destroyed the lost city of Atlantis. And what I took from it is not that, as it were, people ever rediscover the city. In fact, the very recognition that it's all been blown apart by a volcano, or that it hides under the sea, it suggests that there is a kind of impenetrable veil that hides this past civilization from us. And another way we might say that, in a similar way, how people suspect that the dinosaurs are sort of immeasurably before us, or that extraterrestrials are immeasurably beyond us in distance and time, that so on Atlantis sort of would hide behind us in that way. So what we're talking about is not, as it were, finding like the lost nuclear reactors that hide behind under Santorini, but rather we're talking about the eternal call of memory to the collapse of cybernetic systems or sufficiently complex societies that in their hubris, like the Tower of Babel, strive to master the world cognitively and through surveillance and through all of the engines of technology that seem to give us divine powers. So this is the situation in which Plato places it. I think this is to be taken as a myth among many myths that Plato presents us, and a myth that's more of a myth to tell us something about the possibility of reason and a possibility of its exercise for tyrannical purposes that Plato has in mind in the Critias, which was notably unfinished, but also in his other dialogues like the Gorgias, where he critiques Athenian imperialism. And he's notably, both there and in the Republic, he notes how imperialism isn't just, as it were, an exercise of triremes and hoplites on the battlefield, but begins in speeches and in misuse of philosophy. That is, an attempt to use reason to persuade for power rather than for truth, to dissimulate what truth could be so that we can exercise it for the domination of others and for the gathering of force for our own independent purposes. So I think what we're being warned here is that whenever we gather up all power into ourselves, that we are liable to lose our sense of the beginning, and that in order to escape from that cataclysmic permanent possibility that awaits all technological societies that we see, for instance, in the Titanic films and the disaster on the one hand, or in the financial crash of 2007, 2008, or even with the looming threat of nuclear apocalypse that threatens us today, that we have to remember with humility that our own finitude, as well as what comes beyond it, the possibility that that there's more to who we are than what we've yet become and what we could become through our own assertive self-will.
So AI is definitely Atlantean technotheurgy. I feel like the big thing that we're going to continue to see with it is this, like I was kind of talking about before, this perpetual creation of decision points where I think you're going to have kind of this, and like this is where I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing to like continue to accelerate its development, because I think that what's going to be sort of what we're going to be forced to confront in this process is sort of just tendencies that are already pre-existing and imminent within the current order of things, but are kind of just held back in particular ways that actually in many senses sort of prevent people from perceiving them unless they themselves work very, very hard to do so. So I think that kind of, what's a benefit of this maybe somewhat apocalyptic process that AI might kind of help to sort of bring into at least a possible reception for, is that it kind of requires to some extent less work to actually open to and and therefore be exposed to the sort of spiritual stakes of our existence as human beings. So yeah, I mean, I think that what is occurring is that there are lots of different forces. Like AI is sort of just this vector for encountering like all sorts of transhuman, like whether it's angelic, demonic, or sort of ultimately divine forces that but sort of in that process, sort of functionally check humanity on its own titanistic powers, and sort of continually emphasize this problem of the autonomization of human creations over the limitation of humanity to itself. And so kind of in that process, I think that like as we've sort of already seen in the development of AI thus far, what you have is you have a lot of people who kind of become dissidents, who kind of start to discover things and freak out about things that they hadn't really thought about before, kind of the destructive potential of humanity, and sort of go soul searching on like, well, what is the way to sort of avert this destructive potential? I think there are a lot of people who kind of just don't have a strong enough sense of this. Even though when you look at kind of the history of intellectual development of the human race, it's just nothing but people sort of meditating on this problem. So many people today, largely because of the sort of illusions of sort of modern scientific education, they avoid going over this history of human development and sort of struggling with our demons and our sinfulness, and sort of just have almost this naivete of like kind of triumphalist enlightenment naivete that AI, I think, is going to be a major force in sort of undermining, but sort of through that undermining will kind of, I think, help to facilitate the needed reevaluation to kind of like sweep away, hopefully, a lot of that sort of continually abiding naivete that really has no foundation. So
as AI becomes more and more power with its capabilities, maybe even moving away from large language models being the basis of the system, do you think that corporations, as we know them today, are going to be the best institutions to manage them, or it's going to require more of some kind of religious or quasi-religious structure?
So unfortunately, we don't have much of a choice there, because the corporation, especially as it's been legally recognized in the United States and most other countries, is the most efficient organ for gathering up the collective administrative capacity as well as long-term investment to create these engines of calculation, and also to maximize the profit that comes from them in order to deliver successive iterations of their technology over time. So we're sort of trapped with capitalism, as we've been since the Dutch discovered the possibility of a joint stock company in the 17th century. But that doesn't mean that it will last forever. Every empire has fallen, and it may as well. But I think what we have to recognize is that the nation state actually can become more corporate-like, perhaps, in its embrace of these monopoly powers, but may not be in the future as local of a site of the orchestration of the uses of AI and of other technological engines as it had once become. Now, I don't want to suggest that the Westphalian system of nation states is completely obsolete today, because we've seen a resurgence of that today in the rivalry between great powers. But at the same time, I believe that we're recognizing the not only the immense amassment of wealth by corporations, which in a way had happened with the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Companies and so on, but also with new technological abilities that far surpass what many nation states possess. So it's the case today that companies like Google, Facebook, Disney possess much greater wealth and even technical powers than the vast majority of nation states in the world. And it's not impossible that, as we saw, for instance, in the calling upon Elon Musk's SpaceX corporation to use Starlink to feed data to Ukrainian fighters in the war, that they'll become a kind of third echelon in future global power rivalries. With that being said, I think that the sort of triangulation of power today is perhaps between technological corporations, nation states, and international religious orders, and the Catholic Church in particular, which with the Vatican, I think it's the dicastery for evangelization, and for also has a kind of academy for sciences that has been actively engaging with new technological developments. And our new Pope Leo XIV has taken his name directly in memory of Louis XIII, whose Rerum Novarum had engaged with the new technological augmentation of industrial monopolies in the 19th century in such a way that he hopes to challenge the technological monopolies that have grown up with large language models, computing, and new advances in artificial intelligence that promise to empower corporations far beyond what were possible in times past. So I suspect that there may be an unsettling of corporations, but I suspect they'll also be reconfigured in a way that's happened over and over again, even in the history of the 20th century, and that their time is not yet past, even if we might hope that their demise were to come sooner.
All I'm going to say is that even Peter Thiel thinks that there needs to be a political theology of AI alignment.
There is another question in the Q&A. Point of interest. Margaret Yee and Mark Edwards at Oxford had a nascent project called the Golden Tree Project that was aimed at bringing together all the silos of knowledge. They were using Austin Farrer and James McMurray to ground it. I think that was just a comment.
Well, that's fascinating. One point of interest that I have with Mark Edwards and what he spoke about at the Rowan Williams Memorial Conference 2 years ago was how the expectations of artificial intelligence, of transhumanism, and all of our technical futures are in many ways informed by our religious expectations going back to the patristics. So for those who don't know, Mark Edwards is a professor of theology and classics at Christ Church, Oxford, and the foremost origin scholar in the English-speaking world. And he also shares an interest in transhumanism technology. And the reason why this intersects with my project is in exciting ways, because I'm branching out now from my work on the logic of Origin of Alexandria, his theological interpretations, in my new book, Restoring Reason, to exploring the sacramental engines of computers and ultimately our cosmotechnical futures with Teilhard de Chardin. And I want to argue in a way that Teilhard de Chardin is indebted to the Russian cosmists on the one hand, as well as to Vladimir Varanovsky and to Soloviev, and to the Russian revival of patristic studies that is with the expectation that we find explicitly in Soloviev to overcome the titanism of German idealism and find a way of channeling Christ in the sacraments and even divine Sophia, even through the assemblages of technological powers that have gathered up amongst us. So with response to this point of interest, I'll briefly say that I think that the call for transdisciplinarity often arises when we have silos of disciplinary studies. And the silos of disciplinary studies is itself the product of the kind of Humboldtian model of research that we've inherited from our research universities from the past 2 centuries that have become increasingly reified in courses of study that have come down to us today. And I suspect that something of the disinvestment in the academy might also allow for the kind of liquefaction of those boundaries. So we might be able to see that we don't have to have enforced interdisciplinary, because we might find that the best scholars are the ones who are always already sort of prowess and breaking down those boundaries. And I hope that's something that we have exemplified here today at our symposium.
Very nice. I don't see any other questions. There's one other comment I wanted to make. Anna, earlier you were talking about how technology, it's not strictly a neutral medium. There's sort of this nihilistic angle or like nihilistic relationship that people have with it, but ideally, sort of people need to move towards a divine love connection towards technology. I would say I would argue that probably the majority the majority like the way that the majority relate to technology today is more nihilistic. What do you think it takes for people to embrace it in the graceful divine love sort of way?
It's an extremely hard question that maybe everything depends on. So I don't think I have any good answers to it right now. But some of my basic thoughts about it. I mean, I've had a lot of friends over the past few years who've gotten really into ideas of like, let's create new apps that are like designed with a platform logic that is more benevolent to people, right? So like, but the thing about that, and like the reason I said that in a mocking way, is that I feel like it's sort of like those sorts of ideas of like people who are getting really obsessed with like this is a term from Benjamin Bratton, that it's like different, for example, social media platforms or websites or like whatever, even like the hardware of a particular device that we use sort of come along with a particular platform logic, which is like, you know, what are kind of the restraints and the limitations that are introduced by it that tend towards on aggregate sort of incentivizations of particular behaviors. um, my issue with this is that I think just in general, this sort of like pa- this sort of like passive view of what technology should be, which is inevitably sort of mediated through like a statistical frame. And it's like, well, what is the average user doing, and what are the sort of typical ways that its construction sort of nudges people and manipulates people to do certain things. I think that actually the more people think about this, the more that they ultimately undermine like a genuinely kind of gracious mediated use of technology, because it just all comes down to manipulation. That it's like no matter how you engineer it, you either see the problem is like, oh well, the problem is that it's a bad manipulation. What we really should be doing is a good manipulation. There's a really good example of this fallacy. I'm trying to remember the name of the group. There was like some specific like group of like all of like the big like tech oligarchs and a handful of sort of major kind of like AI philosopher types, that I think it came out of this particular initiative to kind of merge humanities and STEM. Like a lot of the kind of, you know, oligarch types are also thinking about the stuff of like, how do we achieve better transdisciplinarity? How do we have kind of like a true elite class? You know, it's sort of, you know, this, and I don't think it's entirely a bad thing to have this kind of like desire for aristocracy of like, well, what would it mean to have that actually like good upper class? I think that's a kind of in many ways a good thing to aspire towards. But yeah, the problem is like you know, they're like the people who do like the nudge economics, behavioral economics. That is one of the sort of favored trends among those people. That it's like what you ultimately, but they all think that they have some idea of what is good, what is a good, what is like a better way for people to be incentivized, and then they try to implement that through these sorts of aggregated statistical tools of manipulation of people. So yeah, basically what I'm trying to get at is that I think this is fundamentally the wrong way to do it. That I think the only way that it really can work, and this is a lot of where I'm really or at least maybe not the only way, but sort of a more compelling way for it to work, and this is where I'm very inspired by Simone Weil's example, is that sort of even with kind of like assuming extremely antisocial forms of manipulative technology, which like from some perspective, any attempt at sort of a positive manipulation will still end up being a harmful one. Individuals and individuals who are kind of also groups of individuals should be capable of consolidating their own spiritual development and seeing technology as playing a part in that, and sort of serving as examples to other people to do this. And in this respect, I'm very inspired also just by like the sort of concept of sanctification and like the history of kind of like the canonization of saints that you see in apostolic Christianity, that it's like it's sort of a model of individual exemplarity, where it's like people who kind of are continually oriented towards like, how do you provide a sort of model for living the good life, and whether this is done as in Christianity kind of broadly on the model of Jesus Christ, or whether it's even just sort of like, you know, the classical ideas of sages, which are literally like cultural universals in human history. I think a lot of the problem is that in modernity we kind of don't have a good sense for this, that it's not only so disincentivized, but it's also just sort of like the culture of suspicion is such that even people who are like really good people are kind of like everyone really always trying to focus on sort of nitpicking everything wrong with them and everything wrong about them, um, and sort of finding the limitation, which is a very very kind of like egoistic way to go, because it's like, look at what I can provide you that you don't have. So I don't know. I do think that there kind of has to be this return to like the like ethos of the sage or the saint or whatever. And even if we all have our own personal limitations that necessarily kind of get in the way of that, I think that that general orientation and the sort of celebration of that kind of way of thinking is a lot more valuable for people than, yeah, just sort of trying to find the ideal manipulation engine for large statistical aggregates of cattle users.
Thank you so much. There aren't any more questions on here, and we're about at the 2.5 hour mark. Are there any other closing remarks you might wanted to make, or wanted to continue any discussions, or?
I'll have something to say briefly.
Yes,
So
go ahead.
I think what's inspiring about Crete, not only that you can come to the precipice of a hillside or a mountain and see clear across the island, but there's a certain sense in which you're standing both at the beginning and also with a gesture to something new, that, and also to further horizon perhaps of Western civilization. So I mentioned at the beginning with my opening remarks that we're standing at the beginning in a number of senses, whether it be the Minoans, who are this sort of archaic but forgotten civilization that stands behind and informs, only distantly remembered in myth, classical Greek civilization, how when we go to the Ideon cave that we see the nursing place of Zeus, the king of the gods, who's also the emblem of lightning strikes of will that enter into and shape cybernetic systems. But there's a certain sense in also I think it's a realm of passing. So we are here as we're between Egypt and Greece, between that which is the most oldest that we can remember in a Western tradition and that which sets the classical model for it. But at the same time, a place that won't ever be what it was once, and for which what we are now is never what we will be again. And so it's a moment of transition in time, embodied in space, that shows us that the conflicts that we find ourselves with today, whether they be artificially engendered, whether they be the threat of a looming sort of techno-apocalypse, that it's one that will pass yet again, and yet will be reconfigured in a hopefully better way, a way that we see written across the countryside, whether it be in little houses that are the homes of the saints, or we see painted on the walls of churches here and there, or in the ancient caves that were the pilgrim place of people from time immemorial, and yet also calls tourists ever afterwards to rediscover it anew. So I think that this is a land of imagination, a bit like Japan, but hidden in the Mediterranean, and one that is both older and newer, but also carries with it the seeds of felicity, and a place that Ætheria is still the harbor of, and hopefully will be ever afterwards.
Yeah, I just want to say on that topic, here we are having these like scholarly discussions of techno apocalypse, and if you just go right out this sliding glass door, which this is covering, and you just stand outside for a second, you're just gonna hear sheep bells just ringing all through the air. We're in a shepherd's village right now. Ætheria is it's a compound in a tiny little shepherd's village in Crete.
We can hear them bawling.
We hear them buy the sheep buying, and all the bells ringing where they on their necks for them to walk around, for the shepherds to keep track of them. And yeah, it's full of, we have all these incredible little, it's very like orthodox, like all like 5 churches in this one tiny village, and all these little like shrines full of icons as well. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good kind of like unity of opposites sort of thing, to have these like futurist institutes that are established in proximity to like kind of like the new and the old, and sort of like maintaining that strong sense of connection also between like the concerns of contemporary urban life and the I guess also like both healing power of the countryside and its own limitations in the sense of its sort of like capacity to address precisely what are the things that are threats to it, which is what I think you kind of have to do by raising yourself to the level of sort of the urbanite futurist ethos, which I think we're bringing to the countryside of Crete here. So
Very grateful to have had you both here, our first real scholars at Ætheria. And this seminar has been very thought-provoking, and yeah, you've engaged many people for these past few hours. And yes, this is Ætheria, where the sheep bells meet avant theology.
Bottom right corner, Stella. Bottom right corner. Bye, everybody.
Bye bye. Thank you. Thanks for coming, everyone.